My name is Kim Mahia, a genius who never missed a calculation, never forgot a debt, and multiplied the family fortune while the others just spent it. I was untouchable, or at least I thought I was. Once, an executive took a massive loan from us and tried to pull a scam, fleeing the country by boat. I went after him alone and took down all his bodyguards. I told him, "You owe us, and nobody gets away without paying, at least not while they are alive." I tied him up and threw him into the sea a few times until he remembered where the money was. He paid me right then and there. When I returned home by boat, I was thinking, my grandfather built this empire, but my uncles, the current owners, were only losing money. I was the only one in that room who actually solved problems. I did it all for my grandmother, who raised me when my parents died. I owed everything to her. But gratitude doesn't exist in this family. When my grandfather died, the war for inheritance began. One day, they called me for an urgent job. It was a lie. They betrayed me and tied me up inside my car. They took me to the coast and pushed the car into the sea, as if it were natural for others to see me inside a car in the middle of the sea. As the car sank into the dark water, I thought this ending was completely unjust. After 30 years of loyalty and hard work, my own uncles killed me just so they wouldn't have to share the money. But fate had other plans. When I opened my eyes, I didn't see the bottom of the ocean. I was lying on the beach. It was 1990. I am a 17-year-old boy again, but with 40 years of experience, hatred, and knowledge of the future inside my head.
But suddenly he was surprised by a guy looking for a fight. As he got up from the kick, he noticed something curious in front of him. There was a group of high school students exchanging punches among themselves, which made the hero think that even in paradise, it was total chaos. The fight was intense, with people taking kicks and others being thrown to the ground. The beach was a complete battlefield, and the protagonist didn't know what was going on. One of the delinquents charged at him, but with tremendous ease, the hero managed to land a solid punch on the thug. The protagonist noticed that his body felt lighter, as if he were young again. Two more thugs ran towards him, but with all his speed and strength, the protagonist kicked them away. None of them were a match for the protagonist, who stood out every time. As if that wasn't enough, the protagonist took down the delinquents one by one with tremendous ease. After that, the hero shot a threatening glance at the thugs, and told the bastards that they had lost and to get out of there. Terrified, the delinquents just ran away as fast as they could. Thus, the protagonist sat on the ground, tired from the fight. One of the hero's allies taunted the losers, asking where they were going and stating that when they met again, he would give them a good beating. This guy asked if Mayuk was okay and said he had come to the beach to flirt with the girls but only found boys there. He then asked if the hero wanted to smoke as he was sweating, which made the protagonist wonder if this guy was really a high school student. Seeing the boy's name on his uniform, the protagonist wondered if that was Lee Myung-soo, his best friend from elementary school. Another friend of theirs arrived, saying that as expected, Muyek was still the best fighter, defeating all of them alone. This guy was Park Han-sung, a close friend of the protagonist who had a police officer father, helping them out of trouble. Now the hero wondered where they were, and his confused friends asked what he meant. They responded that they were in Gwangali. The boys asked if the protagonist had hit his head, as he had started using the Seoul dialect, and was also asking where they were. After this discovery, the protagonist asked what year and date it was, and he was told that it was September 21, 1990. Now his friends were sure that he had hit his head somewhere. Muyuk observed everything around him, trying to better understand the situation. The hero reflected on all the events so far, and with that, he was sure he had drowned in the sea and returned 30 years into the past. His partners were already hungry and decided to look for a bowl of ramen to eat, but suddenly something surged in the protagonist's mind as he remembered that date. So he ran at full speed, leaving his friends confused. That day was the day his grandmother had passed away due to a heart attack. The doctors at the time said that if someone had found her earlier and called an ambulance, she wouldn't have died. Arriving in front of his old house, the protagonist is greeted by his grandmother asking if school had ended early. Upon touching his grandmother's hands, he couldn't hold back and broke down in tears, remembering their memories together. She sees that the protagonist is panting and asks if the reason for this is that he ran home because he was hungry. The hero couldn't contain his tears. Then the grandmother asks if something happened, but he replies that he just missed her very much. The grandmother was confused by the protagonist's behavior, so she said it was as if her Ryuk was a child again. She said he was very handsome when he smiled and even when he cried, wondering when he had grown up so much. But quickly the hero dried his tears and said they didn't have time and needed to go to the hospital immediately. The protagonist argued that his grandmother could faint at any moment and they should check that at the hospital, but she hesitated, saying she wasn't sick. Desperate, Muyek told his grandmother to hurry because she could die, but she still didn't understand why she would die. Now with a happy expression, she said she would only die after seeing him married and raising his children. She entered her house telling her grandson to go to the room and she would prepare the food quickly. Now they were gathered eating their meal. The lady knew her grandson didn't like banchan very much, but he said he liked everything and would eat it all. Seeing the way the protagonist was eating, the lady said that if someone saw him like that, they would think he hadn't eaten for years. His grandmother left the room saying to wait because she had also prepared his favorite corn juice. The protagonist broke down in tears again, saying that all he needed was his grandmother's homemade food and wondered what he was doing being a little dog of the Chin family. But suddenly he heard a noise in the other room, and arriving there, his grandmother was lying on the floor unconscious. With imminent despair, the only solution the protagonist found was to take her to the hospital. The lady was already resting in a room, but still unconscious. In the doctor's office, he said that if they had delayed a little longer, she would be in very bad shape. However, they would need to conduct more tests on her. It was revealed by the health man that surgery would be necessary for the lady, as if she were left like this, she would faint again all the time. The protagonist was shocked to pay the hospital bill and not have a penny in his pocket, as just a short time ago, he was going to collect hundreds of wands. But to his surprise, his partner offered to pay the bill, saying he received his father's pension from an adult entertainment venue that morning. The hero thanked him and said he would pay him back as soon as possible. But they warned him about his behavior, saying that it was for his grandmother's expenses. They told him not to worry about that and just take care of his grandmother for now. However, he was questioned about her condition and medications. In the conversation the protagonist had with the doctor, it was revealed that surgery would be necessary and that the cost was around 10 million won. He knew that 10 million wasn't much before he died, but now he only had a few coins with him. At a payphone, the protagonist came up with an idea to pay for the surgery fee. He called directly to Pyeongchang Dong and said he wanted to speak directly with President Taesun because he had a message for him. The message was that the son of his only daughter, Chin Masuk, wanted to see his grandfather. On the hospital terrace, the protagonist was deep in thought. He reflected that in 1990 there weren't many tall buildings, so it was exactly as he remembered. Fascinated by the fact that he was really back in the 90s, but also anxious about the fact that he could be murdered in 30 years, he suspected his uncle Chien Suman, believing he was the only person who could have sent his subordinates to eliminate him. But he still didn't understand the reason for such an act. As he firmly believed he was still useful to them, he questioned whether it could have been someone else. The protagonist begins to suspect Chien Suhan and Chien Juan, but that didn't matter now as it was his chance. He could finally destroy the Chien family and end the Taesun capital. Suddenly, a delinquent who was also on the terrace starts calling the protagonist. Suspicious, the hero wonders who is calling him now. While the punk asks for his name, the protagonist asks why he wanted to know his name and thinks he must be a thug. Not understanding the protagonist's behavior, the delinquent says he was trying to act tough. The two question where their manners were when speaking to elders. Boldly, the hero tells the bully that he should introduce himself before asking others' names. Already fed up with this, the delinquent says his name is Park Dong-soo and asks if he has heard that name before. The protagonist already knew that name. He was the second in command of the Sasam gang, a legend who became an heir after 2 years in the gang. But in that year of 1990, he was merely pursued for his boss's crimes and ended up being found dead in a hotel at the age of 29. So the delinquent couldn't believe the protagonist didn't recognize him. Thus, the protagonist asks if he ran a comic book store. But already losing patience, the bully says he already said his name and now wants to know the protagonist's. When the hero says his name, the troublemaker says he has the name of a killer, which irritates the protagonist, thinking he was a childish scoundrel. Now the delinquent said there were rumors of the protagonist being the good kid from room 405, who took care of his grandma and did everything she asked. The hero replies that it was normal since his grandmother was his last family, and the troublemaker agrees, saying it was natural. The bully presumes the protagonist would be a student from Dong-sung Vocational School, judging by his uniform. The hero confirms and asks if he was a thug. The tattooed one quickly asserts that he is not and asks why he thought that. The condition the delinquent was in suggested he had been stabbed by someone and thrown in the hospital. The bully argues that it was normal for men to get stabbed once in a while, but kids like the protagonist wouldn't know until they grew up. After that, he adds that the kid shouldn't be afraid of him, as he seemed very calm in front of him, but the hero saw no reason to be scared. The protagonist irritated the punk because he always had the last word. Already fed up, the hero asks if he was done talking because he wanted to leave, and so the delinquent says he was finished. As he leaves, the delinquent calls the protagonist by the killer's name and tells him to take good care of his grandma. At that point, the Sasam gang was not nationally recognized, but it was still not small. Heading to his grandma's room, the protagonist thinks that maybe one day that guy could be useful to him. But upon arriving there, he encounters a mysterious figure in a suit. His grandma says someone was waiting for him. It was a young man in a tie. He was Director Ha, who already knew the protagonist. The two stare at each other for a while, and Muyek says they should go outside to talk. They head to a coffee house, and there the man introduces himself as Hae Myung-hoon, who worked for director Tae-sun. Thus the protagonist knew he was his grandfather's right-hand man. This man was very trustworthy in his boss's eyes. In the protagonist's former life, that man was the only one who told him about his grandfather at his grandma's funeral. The man in the suit said he needed the protagonist to go with him to Seoul, but the hero quickly interrupts, asking why the president didn't come personally. But upon seeing the protagonist's frank look, he gets startled. The director understands his stance and says it was not appropriate for his age, but it was so natural that he couldn't be bluffing. Mr. Hae responds that the director was a busy man and didn't have time to meet him, but the protagonist reveals he wasn't talking about him, and rather about his mother, Kim Mi-jin, but he knew she wouldn't come. The protagonist imagines the man would say it was audacious to ask for her visit, remembering that even the president didn't go to the columbarium after her death. Thus, the hero asserts that if the president wanted to meet him, he would have to go to his mother first. In the protagonist's past, he was forced to obey their orders quietly, as at that time he was nothing more than an orphan. At his grandmother's funeral, Mr. Hae took care of all the costs and told him to meet with the president afterward. The president said that the protagonist should not worry about his survival if he did as instructed. At that time, the protagonist had no choice. Without his grandfather's help, he would have to drop out of school too. However, that would not happen again, as the hero was different with the information he knew about them. Getting up from the table, the protagonist asks Mr. Hae to tell the president that if he wants to meet him, he will have to come in person. He says goodbye to Manhua and wishes him a safe trip back. Mr. Hae felt nervous about the overwhelming presence the protagonist was emitting. The report he had on the protagonist stated that he was a troublemaker who wandered around looking for fights, but he questioned if that was wrong. Thus, he reflected that Mrs. Kim Mi-jin's son was not an ordinary child. Back at the hospital, the protagonist's grandmother was surprised to learn that the president wanted her grandson in Seoul, but the protagonist told her that the president would have to visit his mother first, as after 17 years since her death, he still had not visited her grave. His grandmother was horrified and asked if he knew what kind of person his mother's father was, but he already knew and said that business was in Seoul. The protagonist revealed that he had called them using the phone number his grandmother had hidden, and then asked if that number was what she used to contact her family. Grandma said that Mayuk should be good for his grandfather, but he revealed that he did not want to see him after being ignored for 17 years. Worried, his grandmother said that he could not do that. However, the protagonist replied that he should only worry about his health, as if he had his grandmother, he would not need anyone else. To Mayuk, his grandmother was the person who loved him the most in life, and in the past he had sent her away without warning. But in this new life, he would make her happy. In the Seoul mansion, the president confirmed with his servant the protagonist's words about having to go in person if he wanted to meet him. Mr. Hae stated that the meeting would only take place after he visited his daughter's grave. To the president, this was absurd. It made him think that the protagonist was either very brave or just foolish. Now the old man revealed that the kid had definitely captured his interest. He was determined to go to Busan to see what kind of boy the kid was, and if his grandson proved useful, he would mold him to the bone to become a servant for his family. The protagonist returned to his class downcast, but soon his best friend called him to sit with him. His partner asked about his grandmother's condition, to which the hero replied that she had already left the hospital. His friend said it had been a while since the protagonist had been to school, so he asked if he wanted to skip class to play billiards, but the protagonist quickly declined the offer, saying that as his partner mentioned, he hadn't been to class in a long time. Suddenly, the hero focused completely on the lesson, writing in his notebook while saying they should be ready for class. But this behavior startled everyone present in the room, seeing Mayuk studying, and they wondered what had happened to him. His best friend cried, saying there were 9 years left until the world ended, and the protagonist was studying and reading a book, realizing that something was wrong. Witnessing this, the protagonist remembered that studying was his least priority when he was in high school, starting to study only after finding his grandfather. In the past, the protagonist was oppressed by his old grandfather, who always expected the best possible result, and the only goal set by him was to attend Korea's law university. Although his loan shark grandfather saw no chance of his grandson achieving this feat, he would use it as a metric to see if he was worth it or not. The old man guaranteed that he would not go hungry under his roof, but if the protagonist failed, he could say goodbye to his relationship with the Chin family. With that, the protagonist sat down and through much studying was accepted into the university, thus being able to work for his grandfather. But from that point on, he was drastically used by his family, like a blood servant of the family. Now the protagonist was determined to do things differently. He would study to achieve his new goal. Several students were wandering in the hallway while class was in session. From this, one of the teachers arrived reprimanding them with a bat. He walks into the room, roughly throws his notebook on the table, and tells everyone to pay attention and bow before him. All the students lower their heads in his presence, and with that, The next thing he did was call the protagonist to the front. He judged him by asking how many days he hadn't been to school, and followed up by questioning if he thought it was an amusement park where he could come and go as he pleased. The protagonist apologizes and explains that he had to take care of his grandmother, but at that very moment, he receives a slap from the teacher. Not believing his little story, the teacher says he was a bastard troublemaker, and someone like him would never take care of his own grandmother. He was probably drinking somewhere. The teacher still didn't believe that lie, while the protagonist remembers that teacher from the first grade classroom. He abused his students as if they were animals, continuing to belittle the hero by saying he was out of his mind to confront him like that. The protagonist reflected that the teacher must have been a little over 30 years old and didn't understand why he treated him that way. That bastard shamelessly asked for bribe money when he visited the protagonist's grandmother. Disregarding this act, the hero made his grandmother stop giving the thousands of won she fought so hard to earn, which is why the scoundrel always picked on him whenever he could. The teacher continued mistreating Wuyuk, making him lie on the floor, saying he knew he was always looking for trouble. The abuser argued that kids like the protagonist always became gangsters when they left school. But suddenly, the vice principal enters the room, causing panic in the teacher. He was asking if there was a student named Wuyuk in that classroom. The teacher went into shock upon realizing he was caught in the act. A completely black car and the suited Mr. Ho were waiting for the protagonist outside the school. As the man asked the hero to get into the car, everyone at the school watched from the windows, confused to see an imported car. When the protagonist gets into the car, he finds his grandfather in person. President Chien Taizhen was waiting for him, asking if he was the son of Misuk. The protagonist reflected that they finally met again, and the last time he saw him was before he died 20 years ago. Thus, he confirms that his father was Kim Tae-soo and his mother Chien Misuk. With an air of superiority, the old man says he was there in person as the hero requested. Soon after, the protagonist asks if his grandfather stopped on the way to visit his mother's grave, and the old man confirms that he did seriously. The protagonist argues that he heard his grandfather didn't visit his mother even once, so he thought it was more appropriate to stop by before talking to him. He adds that his grandmother, who raised him, wasn't well, so he couldn't abandon her and wasn't interested in apologizing for that. Observing the hero's posture, the old man questions whether he was really a child, as he didn't seem intimidated in his presence at all. The old man asked if the protagonist really knew him, but the protagonist knew he was a legend in the lending industry, coming to the south as a day laborer. There wasn't a single person, chaebol, or politician who hadn't borrowed money from him back then. Even during the 90s, he ruled the entire country with trillions of money. However, the protagonist responds that he only knew him a little, just knowing that he controlled a business. The old man says he managed a small lending business in Seoul, and then asks if the protagonist knew what that was. But the hero knew it wasn't a small business. Without beating around the bush, the old man asks what the protagonist wanted. With great confidence, the protagonist reflects that he only desired one thing: to take down the Chien family and seize their fortune. The best revenge the protagonist could take from the Chien brothers was the money. They would receive a huge wealth as inheritance after Chien Taizhen's death, and the hero planned to take all that inheritance for himself. But for him to do that, he would have to secretly secure funds to fight them without the Chien family finding out. Once again, the old man asks why he had been called there, and the protagonist replies that he needed to borrow money. Upon hearing this, the old man thinks that after everything, it was still about money, finding it pathetic despite everything, and asks how much the hero wanted. The protagonist reveals that his grandmother, who raised him for 17 years, needed heart surgery, so he needed 10 million won for that. And he adds that he also needs 1 million won every month until his graduation for tuition fees and living expenses. Upon hearing the proposal, the old man says he could easily manage that for him, questioning the protagonist's sanity for calling him there for pocket change. But the protagonist reveals that he wasn't asking for it for free, he was just borrowing it for a while. The old man found it very amusing that this kid was asking for money, considering he couldn't even pay the interest and still didn't want to lend the money for free. Thus, the gentleman responds that it wasn't difficult for a loan shark to lend money to someone, but they didn't allow you to ask for money without a reason. Now, intimidating the protagonist, the old man says he should be able to pay it back and asks if he has any collateral or credibility for that. But quickly, the protagonist says that his collateral is his brain, and the old man is surprised by the answer. The hero asserts that if he receives the loan, he will enroll in Korea University and use that as collateral to pay off the debt. The president was left speechless upon hearing the protagonist's proposal. In the past, the old man had asked the protagonist to do this, but now this was his offer. Chien Taizhen had a great desire for academic achievements, but he couldn't get the proper education because he was poor, and as his businesses grew, he became even more obsessed with his children's academic accomplishments. Even the protagonist's mother was accepted into a prestigious university in Seoul, but she ended up dropping out. So having his grandson accepted into Korea University would be an attractive proposal to try to erase his inferiority complex due to his previous education. The old man reflected that the protagonist was not capable of getting into the university because his grades were poor. Thus, he thought that perhaps he was bluffing. At that moment, the gentleman asked how confident the protagonist was and questioned what he would do if he failed. However, the hero reflected that he succeeded once, but he had no guarantee he would succeed again. Yet he knew he should get as much interest from his grandfather as possible. So he responds that if he doesn't get in, he will give him his head and also his body, asking if that would be enough. Upon hearing that the protagonist was offering his body, the old man said that was sufficient. Soon after, the protagonist said that if he passes, he would like to receive a gift to congratulate him, and the old man was astonished, wondering if he wanted something more as well. But the protagonist said he would only reveal it after he got into Korea school. However, he hinted that he planned to ask for a big gift when that happened. The old man's reaction was nothing less than bursting into laughter, saying he could hardly wait to see how great the gift would be. However, the old man said that if the protagonist failed, as promised, he would be his and would have to do anything the old man asked. These things he would do would make even demons afraid to do them. But the protagonist didn't back down and said the deal was already made. But after the long conversation, the old man sped away in his car, and the protagonist said that old gray man was trying to scare a child. The hero liked the idea that even demons would fear the old man's tasks. The protagonist exclaimed that if he had to become a demon, he would become the one who would tear the Chin family apart. In traffic, the old man commented to his driver that the protagonist was a fun kid, and the driver revealed that he was shocked to see how different the protagonist was from the reports he had received. The gentleman said he had encountered all kinds of people in his business, from those who didn't pay back and boldly asked for more to those who brought gangsters to threaten him, and even people who sold their own children for money. Then the gentleman revealed that after making many deals with various people over time, he couldn't distinguish what kind of person they were at first glance. He argued that body language, eyes, and tone of voice could say a lot about what kind of person you were. However, the old man couldn't get a read on the protagonist, saying it seemed he was the only one judging him. Upon hearing this, the driver said it seemed the old man had taken a liking to the kid, but suddenly, the gentleman said for them to head to Dahang Hospital. Inside the hospital, the protagonist asked for them to take care of his grandmother, and the doctor said not to worry, as it wasn't a difficult surgery. As the hero left the place, the surgery was taking place. The delinquent from the other day arrives asking if he goes to school every day and eats 3 meals a day. The big guy invites him to smoke on the terrace, but the hero questions whether he should say that to a high school student and admits to feeling guilty. The delinquent questions why the protagonist studies so young, saying he should enjoy life. Meanwhile, the bum says that if he needs to study, he won't hold him back and thus hands him a piece of gum, saying that when he feels sleepy, he should chew it. And with that, he says goodbye, saying he would see him later. The protagonist reflected that this man, at that moment, was a well-known criminal, responsible for a gang that commanded hundreds of members. But he didn't expect that guy to be a very fun type. However, soon, when the crime war began, Park Dong-soo would meet a terrible end. While reflecting, the protagonist notices that suspicious men have arrived at the hospital door, and they are carrying weapons. The protagonist knew that, supposedly, Park Dong-soo would not die that day, so perhaps he could bring him to his side at that moment. At the reception, the suspicious men asked the attendant where Park Dong-soo's ward was. Frightened, the girl questions their relationship with the patient, but the men rudely respond that they are there to visit him. Suddenly, the protagonist appears, greeting them and asking if they were looking for his brother, claiming to be his younger brother. He then says he would guide the men to his room, leaving the guys confused. The protagonist was bothered by the fact that those worms were causing a commotion in the hospital where his grandmother was undergoing surgery, so he decides to take them outside the hospital. As the men followed the hero, they realized what he was planning and questioned where they were being taken. Maniac asks if they were there to eliminate Park Dong-soo, and one of the men pulls out a knife, asking who the protagonist was. The protagonist was already stretching, preparing for a fight. But suddenly, Park Dong-soo appears behind them, asking if they had no shame pointing a knife at a student. One of the thugs reacted by charging at the delinquent to punch him. But surprisingly, Park Dong-soo defends the punch using his head. As the guy cries out in pain from his hand, the tattooed man trips him and lands a solid punch, making him bounce on the ground. The other members are already on high alert, and while the mugger takes off his shirt, another one charges at him with a knife. But soon he stops this other scoundrel with a few blows, and before he falls to the ground, Park throws him into another thug. And with precision, he also throws his sandal at the face of the same thug and kicks both of them away. The remaining man notices that there are glass windows beside him, so he decides to try to hit Park with them. But it didn't work at all, as Dong-soo breaks through the window with a punch, hitting the thug and sending him flying. The relentless man and the protagonist stared at each other for a few moments without saying a word. After everything, they were already inside the hospital, and Park said it felt good to let loose after a while, mentioning that he had fought those guys before over territory. He already knew they were looking for him while he was in the hospital. Having had his eyes on them, the protagonist had already led them there. Thus, the bully says that Muyek had courage since he wasn't scared when they pointed a knife at him. To this, the protagonist replies that he only acted that way because he knew Park would come, and also mentions that he noticed his subordinates watching the hospital. Even if the protagonist hadn't intervened, the outcome would have been the same, with Dong-soo having completely dominated them. However, Park feels he owes something to the protagonist, so he asks what his wish would be, saying he would do anything from money to women. The protagonist reflects that the first tool of his plan would be Dong-soo, so he should make him his property. Thus, the hero tells the tattooed man to take the closest subordinates and hide for 3 months. The big guy quickly gets irritated, saying that the protagonist could make any request, but he was talking nonsense, asking why he should hide. The protagonist reveals that the president would declare a war on crime and arrest all criminal organizations. Park goes into total shock upon hearing about the war on crime. In October 1990, the president issued a special decree to prevent public criticism of various corruptions. Although there was a crackdown on the 5 major crimes from the previous year, the president's announcement of a war on crime would be different. It was a large-scale operation to eradicate the major and minor criminal organizations linked to them. The protagonist was now telling him to keep the location a secret, even from other organizations. He added that he should be very careful with his boss, Lee Se-sung. Thus, the protagonist ended the conversation by saying that this was his only wish. The hero knew that the decision was now with Park, and that if he survived, he could be useful someday. A month later, what the protagonist told Dong-soo became a reality. The news reported that the Constitution granted total authority to the president to clean everything up, and the newspaper stated that even the prosecutor and the police were mobilized and all organizations in Busan were captured. Park Dong-soo only heard this from his colleagues, but he already knew everything. He told his companions not to do anything and not to go out causing trouble for no reason. Upon reading the newspaper, the little thug was surprised because it happened exactly as the protagonist said. When he was told about this, he only questioned what nonsense the protagonist was saying to him. However, he said it was worth wishing for reunification. The protagonist, with a smile, exclaimed that the wish would be fulfilled in Germany, but not by them. Back in the present, the frightened gangster wondered who the mysterious figure Kim Moo-hyuk was. And already at home, the protagonist told his grandmother that the old man took care of everything and that she shouldn't worry about anything. The hero explained that he inherited an apartment and money from his grandfather, who had been absent for 17 years, and told his grandmother that she didn't need to work anymore. The lady couldn't accept all of this calmly, but the protagonist argued that she worked very hard to raise him alone and deserved much more than that. The protagonist assured her that she would live comfortably and told her to think only about her health. Suddenly, the door opened with the protagonist's friends arriving, saying they bought ribs and congratulating the hero's grandmother for being discharged. They were all excited and happy, and they planned to grill the meat and enjoy the rest of the day. After a while, the boys were at school commenting that the weather was nice, but the fact that the tests were that day was ruining their mood. The protagonist's friends were arguing about who was better at studying, with one being in the top 500 and the other already out of the top 520 students. One friend asked about the exam, and the protagonist said he only improved a little and needed to work harder. The hero reflected that it was difficult to get back to studying after so long, but he managed to do a good job. As the boys were arriving in the classroom, one of the boys said that Muyek was in first place in the exam. His friends were extremely surprised by this fact, and the boy said he heard it from the teacher's office that morning. Suddenly, one of the students informed the protagonist that he was being called to the teacher's office. His classmates assumed he was going to receive some award, so he should be excited. Inside the office, the teacher asked if the protagonist knew why he had been called there. Muyek, unresponsive, left the teacher without an answer, which made him slap him. His classmates watching from the window were anxious to see the scene. Once again, the teacher asked if he didn't know why he was there, and the protagonist confidently said no. Thus he received another slap in the face, and the teacher continued questioning what he did on the exam, whether he cheated or did something wrong. The teacher argued that the hero was among the worst students in the school last semester, and that now, in this one, he was in first place. The hero knew that the teacher acted this way because days earlier he mentioned knowing that the man in the car the protagonist got into was his grandfather. Thus, the teacher argued that it was fair for the protagonist's grandfather to congratulate him since he had been his guardian since elementary school. This attitude disgusted the protagonist, who said that the old man was the epitome of trash, much worse than he remembered. The hero simply replied that his grandfather lived in Seoul, and that if he wanted to meet him, he would have to go there, but the teacher said that maybe the old man would come to see him again. The teacher tried again to convince the protagonist to talk to his grandfather, but he said that if that was all, he would leave because he had an exam soon. This attitude caused unease and anger in the teacher, who called Muyek back. Back in the present, the abuser was sure that the protagonist had cheated and asked if it was just him or if others had helped as well. Once again, the protagonist responds that he hadn't cheated at all. The teacher said he had already suspended the protagonist for issues and accused him of causing trouble again, asking if he learned that from his grandmother. When mentioning his grandmother, the hero thinks that Guy had crossed the line, being very annoying. The scoundrel asked what the hero was staring at and said he should gouge out his eyes. The protagonist was extremely furious, telling the old man to apologize because, even if he studied or was cheating, his grandmother had nothing to do with it. But once again, he received another slap in the face with the teacher saying he was crazy. From there, the tutor began tearing up all the protagonist's tests, saying they didn't even need to be checked because they would be marked as 0 for cheating. The teacher declared that the protagonist was suspended indefinitely and stated that he would like to expel him but couldn't. Not satisfied, the hero proposed a bet with his teacher. He exclaimed that he would solve all the test questions in front of him just as he did in the exam. And so, if he didn't achieve the same score, he could be expelled from school without issue. But if he achieved the same score, he demanded that the teacher resign from his position at the school, which shocked everyone present. The teacher tried to resort to violence once again, about to hit the protagonist with a stick, but he was stopped by the protagonist, asking if he wasn't confident. And so, the protagonist demanded that they bring the test papers. Sometime after the events, everyone was still anxious for the outcome of the story. The protagonist had already completed a large part of the tests. At the moment the teacher was grading them, it was noticeable that all of them had the same maximum score. One of the teachers said that the protagonist was finishing the English test and that if he had a perfect score, he would have aced all subjects. Putting pressure on the abuser, the hero said he was on his last question and that if he was correct, the teacher would have to leave the school forever. And so he added that if he didn't keep his promise, he couldn't expect him to treat him like a teacher. Everyone watching became tense at the sight of the whole scene. However, the protagonist exclaimed that if the teacher apologized at that moment, he would stop solving the questions. The abuser didn't like the hero's tone at all, but suddenly the principal arrived, telling both of them to stop, as it was enough, and added that the protagonist had already proven he didn't cheat on the test. The old man said that the teacher should apologize to the protagonist and ended by saying he should praise him so that his grades would improve. And while everyone watched, the scoundrel apologized to the protagonist. He said he had misunderstood everything, but still couldn't look the protagonist in the eyes. With all the reason and confidence, the protagonist slammed his pen on the table and said seriously that he would return to his classroom at that moment. And as he walked to his destination, all the students watching celebrated his victory. The students watched anxiously at the scoreboards and rankings. It was now announced to everyone that the protagonist had come in first place in the exam, and his friends commented on how scared the teacher looked after everything. However, they were in disbelief that Muyek had come in first place, so they questioned whether he would go to university in Korea. With seriousness, the hero told Mungsu to start studying earnestly, and that he would also help him, and he advised Hansung to practice judo again. The protagonist reflected that Mungsu had high grades for high school, but in the end, he chose a vocational school to follow his passion. While Hansung was a promising fighter in judo during high school, he chose that school without a sports team just to avoid separating from his friends. However, the hero's friends were not excited about the ideas. One thought about working in factories while he was young, and another thought about taking over his father's business. The protagonist approached them and said seriously that in the near future, they would need to do important things in Seoul. And being realistic, he exclaimed that it would be very difficult to do it alone, so he truly hoped for their help in the future. Thus, they were determined to work hard and go to Seoul together, with the protagonist reflecting that his revenge was not guaranteed just by knowing the future. He concluded that he needed partners who wouldn't betray him, and those comrades he could trust to have his back were his friends. As time passed, the protagonist continued to focus on his studies, and with that, he easily came in first place in the final exam rankings. Myung-soo's grades weren't the best, but he also started to improve, together with Hyusung starting to practice judo again. Thus, all the pieces were falling into place, and after a while, on a cold and snowy day, the protagonist was facing the impenetrable fortress of the Chin family. And along with Hanamdong, Pyeongdo-chang was one of the richest areas in the country, and there was the base of the Chang family, Pyeongdo-chang. While the property was valued as the most valuable in terms of money mobilization, the Third Republic seized power through a military coup, and there was also the Fourth Republic, which also took power through another coup, all during the same regime. However, the impenetrable fortress of the Great Loan Shark protected his wealth from all these powers, and at that moment, the protagonist was having dinner with his grandfather inside his residence. He reflected that this scenario did not happen in his past life, as he met Chien Taizan long after being accepted into Korea University. Thus, he concluded that it meant his grandfather's evaluation of him had changed. In that cold and mysterious room, the silence of the men spoke louder than any word. The old man commented that he heard his grandson managed to rank first in school twice. However, the old man argued that the level of the prota's school, not being exceptional, did not mean much, but it seemed he was not just bragging the last time. Thus, the loan shark was surprised and pleased with his grandson's intelligence, and so he said that as long as he kept those promises, he wanted to gift him something and asked what he would like. However, still mysterious, the prota said that as mentioned before, he would only say what he wanted when he entered Korea University. The old man knew that the promise was that when he entered that university, it didn't matter what the gift was. Still, he wanted to know what the prota wanted at that moment. The hero noticed that his grandfather was trying to be kind, so he concluded that he should ask for an allowance. And boldly, the protagonist asked his grandfather for some shares of his company. The old man was surprised by the request and asked if the protagonist understood anything about the stock market. The protagonist replied that he didn't know much, which is why he asked for help. Thus, the prota questioned which companies would be good options for him to buy shares. With that, the hero presumed that if he asked for shares instead of money, his grandfather would consider it a nice request from his grandson. The old man smiled and asked the director what their stake in the Diane Corporation was, and it was revealed to be 4%. To everyone's surprise, the loan shark ordered that the entire percentage be allocated to his grandson and asked them to ensure the correct payment of taxes, as it was a gift for him. The hero was surprised to see that he would be given shares of Diane, as at that time it was the company with the largest conglomerate, ranking first among the huge corporations. However, after the founder's death, the company split due to conflicts among the heirs, and shares of that company were not just about money. Now the hero was immensely grateful to his grandfather, keeping in mind that it was extremely difficult to obtain shares of Diane, even if you had money. The prota did not expect to receive such a great gift, as he honestly thought he would only get some allowance, and at that moment, unexpectedly, the loan shark's sons had arrived at the residence. Strong presence people were there, among them were Chien Suman and Chien Suhan. Chien Suman asked if the prota was Nisuk's son. Now Nguyik was face to face with the people he had been searching for, those scoundrels who ordered his death. The old man told the prota to greet his uncles, but the prota knew they were suspicious, though he wasn't sure due to the circumstances, so he decided to stay under the radar. So he introduced himself formally and friendly, and his uncles said they heard he grew up with a lot of difficulty without his mother, being raised only by his grandmother. Thus, Suman approached the prota and said that anything he needed, he just had to say, because despite everything, they were still family. One of the sons asked if the mother-in-law of one of the daughters was doing well in business, as he heard that the Samsung group was in a difficult position. However, the girl replied that everything was fine, and it was just the media making up stories as they pleased. She added that her father-in-law would not let that happen. The old man agreed, saying that man was relentless and never shed tears or blood. The loan shark added that his daughter should clarify that the father-in-law could always count on him, because through marriage, they were also family and should not be ignored. Now the white-haired man was questioning his other son about Mr. Kim, and was told that the father-in-law was doing a good job by actively participating in political matters without issues. Once again, the old man said that if they had problems, they could come to him to avoid losses, as he did not want to get involved in trouble due to illegal exchanges. And after all this conversation, the white-haired man asked if any of his sons had sent money to President Lee Hak-soo. He argued that money should not be used that way, as the requester should come before him and plead for the money, and thus never give it before that. One of the sons got nervous and asked his father if he did not know who President Lee Hak-soo was and feared that he would break his promise. Another son was also terrified, saying that if their father did that, the Chien Peng would not just stand by. And so, tension filled the air, and with all the idle chatter, the old man became furious as the atmosphere grew even darker outside. The protagonist was now inside his mother's old room, and while rummaging through the shelves, he reflected that it was exactly as it had been in his past life. As he picked up one of the books from the shelf and began to leaf through it, he came face to face with a photograph of his grandfather and his late mother. Thus, he reflected that this was the only photo he had managed to find of his mother in his past life, and that his grandfather had not left any others behind. It was as if that old man wanted the whole world to forget about the hero's mother. Suddenly, the door to the room opened while the protagonist was still rummaging through the items. He was surprised to see Chian Ji-won questioning if that was Mizuki's son. Muyek suspected that this bastard had ordered him killed in his previous life, because in his eyes, the protagonist seemed to be a stone in his path regarding inheritance. Ji-won knew that the protagonist came from Busan and asked how it was to come from so far to Seoul, stating that it must be difficult to adjust to everything. The hero simply asked who that man was, and he responded by asking why the protagonist was being so direct, considering he was older than him, and asked if people from Busan did not know what it meant to have manners. Muyuk merely reflected that this man was extremely childish and that he had remained so even since the last life. This was a tremendous stroke of bad luck. Fed up, the hero silently put the book back on the shelf. Then with hostility he approached the man and told him that it did not matter if he was older, as he was speaking informally for the first time they met and was still asking for respect. The young man soon went into shock at the way the protagonist addressed him, and the hero knew that he did not expect such a reaction, as it seemed to be the first time someone had shown him any hostility. His father was the eldest son of the Lone Shark King, and his mother was the eldest daughter of the president of the Samsung Group, so no one would dare treat him with disrespect. With that, Ji-won wondered why that nobody was so arrogant, and told the protagonist that that place was not for people like him. After that, boldly, the man asked the hero how much he wanted to leave there, starting by offering 100 million, saying that with that he would live very well. The protagonist recalled that previously that fool had said the same thing, but in the past he could not say anything, so he acted like an idiot. Now the hero sarcastically told his brother that he was very generous for giving him crumbs of money. But Jin's confused reaction made the protagonist explain that with that amount they could only afford to eat sashimi at a mediocre restaurant. Jiwon rudely said that now he understood why the protagonist did not have parents, and looking at him, one could tell in what state his grandmother, who raised him alone, was. Furious, the hero punched the door in the direction where the young man was. Now he asked if that man wanted to be beaten by a country bumpkin who had never learned anything because he had no parents. Frightened, the jerk asked if the protagonist thought he could get away unscathed after doing all this to the eldest son of the Chin family. He argued that he would tell everything to his grandfather, but was interrupted by the protagonist, telling him to stop, because he knew that the grandson, Jin-won, of the Samsung Group, loved drugs and was resorting to smuggling, which could be reported in the news, completely confused. The young man, reckless, asked what the protagonist was trying to say, and so he comments that he would tell him about the other children in the family, the same ones who threw a party at the hotel that ended up sending a girl to the hospital. Ji-won still didn't understand how the protagonist knew about that. However, the hero says that, above all, that boy was just a child, and besides that, he was confident about going down to tell everything to his grandfather. Muyuk knew all the incidents caused by that boy in his past life, but surprisingly, those that had been caused so far were nothing compared to those in the future. Confidently, the prota says that if that man wanted to be treated like an older brother, he should act like one. And that sentence leaves Jin-won completely in shock. Ready to lie down, the prota says that his brother should leave now because he wanted to rest, as he was already tired. Still nervous about the situation, Jin-won says that the prota should never speak about this with anyone else, because if he did, one of them would die there. And so he asks if he understood what he was saying. With superiority, the hero asks if that was a request or a threat. Still scared, his brother says it was just a request. Already tired of that conversation, the prota says he understood and wanted to keep his mouth shut, and tells his brother to leave his room quickly. Ji-won leaves, slamming the door in a hurry. The hero reflects on whether Jin-won was the person who killed him in his past life, and he couldn't believe he was defeated by someone like that. The night passed, and the next day, the prota was walking around the house until he met his grandfather, who asked him if he was leaving. The hero confirms that he was leaving the house at that moment, bowing to his grandfather, and thus he says goodbye. Still with his head down, the prota says he would come back to visit him more often. The grandfather again says goodbye without saying anything, and the prota finally leaves the house. Already on the street, Muyuk received 100 million wons from the director, who said it was a gift from the president, as he thought just having shares in Hyun was not enough. And so the director reveals that the password for that device was the protagonist's mother's birthday. The prota wonders if that meticulous Chable Tazen who always took care of his things was the same one witnessing this now, and tells the director to thank him. However, the man says that Muyuk should call him himself, as he was sure his grandfather was waiting. Time passed quickly, and the hero was already in his second year of school, transferred to a new class, while his friend Myung-soo continued studying diligently, and the other one was dedicated to his judo club. They were all doing their best to keep the promise of going to university in Seoul. While in his classroom, the protagonist knew someone was arriving. Thus, the teacher enters the room introducing a transfer student who came from Seoul. The mysterious boy introduces himself to the class, saying his name was Hong Jin-pyo, and that he came from Seoul, and so the prota knows that this type of person is a beast. The new student was eating with the other students in a restaurant while smoking and asks them who the head of their school was. The boys are confused and ask if he meant if there was a boss at the school. However, they didn't have that person, but the closest to that title was the protagonist. Thus, the new student was interested in Muyuk, and the boys told him that the prota was indeed the strongest in the second year. The students commented that last year, at the beginning of the semester, The strongest called those with the most potential. When the seniors arrived at the protagonist's table, they saw that he wasn't listening to anything they were saying because he was sleeping deeply. Boldly, one of those guys taps the hero on the head, and he quickly sits up, but still drowsy, he manages to comprehend the situation quickly. The prota gives a threatening look to the senior and throws him to the ground with all his strength, and in the blink of an eye, he had already defeated all the wrongdoers. With that, he returns to his chair and says he would go back to sleep, and that no one should wake him up again. Returning to the present, the students said that no senior dared to touch him again after that incident. However, he concludes that he died, and now he was focused on his studies. The newcomer couldn't accept that the protolid focused on his studies when he was the strongest, thus saying that he was arrogant and that he would like to play with him. The students ask if he intended to fight the hero and advised him not to start a fight for no reason, as the protagonist was on a completely different level. With that, the arrogant guy says that fighting well doesn't mean you will always win, thus confirming that the students were not with him because he defeated them in a fight, but rather because his father was the chief prosecutor and now question what the protagonist's father did. The students report that the hero had no parents and lived with his grandmother. However, they did not know what his grandmother did. The arrogant guy is surprised by the fact that the protagonist didn't even have parents and becomes full of himself. Now back at school, the protagonist was talking to his friend, saying that Hansung had returned to the sports club after resting for a good while. He mentions that Hansung was determined to get into a physical education college by following a strict diet. Now the hero's friend asks if he has heard about the new student, Jinpyo, who transferred from Seoul, being an annoying guy who spoke in the local dialect. The protagonist remembers this guy, the son of the chief prosecutor who used his father's influence to run the school as he pleased. His classmate says that the seniors were on a trip and Jinpyo was forming a circle, making even the freshmen act like gangsters, turning the school into his playground. Suddenly, they spot the annoying kid they were talking about passing by them. Jinpyo notices the protagonist's presence, and the same goes for Muil, who was already alert. With seriousness in his voice, the hero tells Mungsun to never get involved with those guys. However, Mungsun says he is worrying for no reason, as there was no reason to get involved with them. But once again, the protagonist reinforces that he should stay away from them, and his friend questions why he cares so much, wondering if it was because they knew some weakness of his. As the bullies walked away, the protagonist remembers his past with his friend, saying that something bad had happened to Mingsun. This friend reported that while Myeongsun was fighting, he seriously injured his leg, thus unable to walk anymore. Furious, he adds that it was all the fault of that transferred student, as he used his father's influence to never be questioned. The protagonist was frustrated with the whole situation, but only said that it had nothing to do with him, and that he just wanted to focus on his studies. He regretted those events, therefore he didn't want to get involved with something annoying again, as he ignored Mangsu, his closest friend. However, now he was determined never to give up on the things that were precious to him, no matter who it was. In the classroom, while the short guy was studying, he was approached by the new student and the bullies who walked with him. Initially, he asks if Myeongsun was close to the student named Muhyuk and claims to have heard that he was very good at fighting. The short guy quickly argues, telling him not to worry, as Muhyuk was just focused on his studies now, thus having nothing to do with him. Jinpyo is surprised and asks if the protagonist had any problem with Jinpyo taking over the school. And once again, Myeongsu confirms, showing his finger, that he could do whatever he wanted with the school, as Muhyuk had nothing to do with it. But Jinpyo just says that the protagonist deeply irritated him. Now already furious, the short guy asks what the protagonist did to him, and why he insisted on annoying someone who was just trying to study. Now the bully opens up, saying that he hated when people thought some bastard was better than him. He then uses the bullies beside him as an example, saying that it seemed they were more afraid of Muhyuk than of him. Once again, Myeongsun tells him not to irritate the protagonist, and one of the bullies doesn't like his tone, saying that he was a loser and should watch his words, as without Muhyuk he was nothing and would end up shitting his pants. But before the bully could do anything, the arrogant guy stops him and says that the big issue was that whenever he wanted something, he got it, and whenever he wanted to break something, he broke it. Not understanding anything, the protagonist's friend asks if he was retarded or something like that, and quickly one of the bullies slams his head against the table with all his strength. The bully says that all of this was because he was close to that bastard named Muhyuk, so he shouldn't take it personally, and thus he orders them to let Mingsun go. While the protagonist was studying, one of his classmates ran towards him saying they had a big problem. He reported that Myeongsu had been caught by Jinpyo, who said that the prota should go to the band room. Without thinking twice, the protagonist dashed off to save his friend, reflecting that no matter how much he tried to avoid it, this meant it was going to happen again. On his way to meet Jinpyo, the prota encountered one of his partners, who asked what they meant by Myeongsu being caught by someone named Jinpyo. The hero tried to calm his friend down, saying he would take care of everything, but he wasn't easily accepting of just standing by while Myung-soo was taken by some bastard. The protagonist reflected that after training for a year, Myung-soo had become a promising talent in Busan, and if he got involved in violent incidents at school, he might have to give up his dreams. Thus, seriously, Moo-yuk told his friend to calm down, as he was an athlete and causing trouble at school would negatively impact college admissions. However, once again, Hyung-sung debated with the prota, saying he didn't care about college at that moment because if anything happened to Myung-soo, he would definitely deal with that bastard. Already losing patience, the protagonist raised his voice, saying he needed to do things in the future and would need his friend's help, so he earnestly asked him to let him handle it. With that, the hero prepared for the fight, grabbing a broom handle and telling Kyung-sung to focus on not letting anyone come to them, no matter who it was, even a teacher. His partner was surprised and asked if he was really going to handle everything alone, and the prota replied that his partner probably forgot he was Kim Moo-yuk. Upon arriving at the room, Mo-ryuk came face to face with several students ready to fight along with Jin Pyo around his buddy. Seeing the protagonist's arrival, the scoundrel said they weren't joking when they said that if he messed with Myung-soo, Moo-yuk would definitely show up. With that, he added that if the hero hadn't shown up, he would have broken Myung-soo's ankle. Not believing the situation, the prota's friend asked what he was doing there. Thus, the hero argued with Pyo that if he had something to discuss with him, he should go directly to him instead of involving his friends. The bastard burst out laughing and tried to remember why he always did this until he recalled that he did it because he thought it would be fun. The prota was getting more and more irritated and now told him to let Myung-soo go immediately, saying he would play with him, making everything more fun. The scoundrel was disgusted by the protagonist's words and asked if they were filming a movie about the loyalty of Busan boys. After that, he called his henchmen to come to him, but they were very apprehensive. Already losing his patience, Jin Pyo raised his voice due to his henchmen's disobedience, asking if they knew who his father was. He argued that if his father lifted a finger, he would make sure they spent their entire lives in prison, along with all the consequences. And thus, the order was given for everyone to attack the protagonist. The first unfortunate soul who tried to charge at the hero received a blow to the throat that destabilized him. Two more delinquents charged at the hero, but he defended himself and took care of them easily, kicking one away. But caught by surprise, he received a hit to the back, but quickly retaliated with his broom handle, hitting the villain in the face. The students were becoming increasingly frightened, and Jin Pyo was impatient, telling them to bring the prota to him. The conflict escalated, with blood flying everywhere, and ended with the protagonist defeating everyone present. Thus, the spoiled brat fell into a deep state of shock. Quickly, the scoundrel pointed a knife at Myung-soo's neck, telling the prota to stay back or he would stab his partner. However, the hero wasn't falling for his empty threats and swiftly landed a punch to his face, sending him flying. Even though he was on the ground, the scoundrel didn't let go of his ego and said that the prota wouldn't get away with it because his father was the chief prosecutor. And so he explained more clearly that his father had the power to make anyone rot in prison for the rest of their life. The prota didn't care and said that a prosecutor was useless when his fists were closer to the law. And so he begins a series of punches, saying that all of this was for kidnapping his friend Myung-soo and for interrupting his precious study time. And finally, the protagonist retaliates by breaking the ankle of that scoundrel, saying it was revenge for breaking Myung-soo's as well. The bastard begged him not to do it, but the protagonist was already beside himself, and thus he did as promised. Now the protagonist found himself locked up in a police station, and suddenly his friend's uncle arrived looking for him. He said that Ryung-soo informed him that by saving Myung-soo, he had been arrested. The uncle informed him that Myung-soo was not hurt. The man reported that they had a big problem because the hero was caught fighting the wrong person, who was the prosecutor's son, and even though he was a police officer, he couldn't do much about this case. Thus, the protagonist asked for a single favor, and the officer was willing to grant it, which was a phone call that would only take a moment. Night had already fallen, and suddenly a furious man entered the police station, asking where the protagonist was, and upon finding him, the hero came face to face with the prosecutor, asking if he was the one who broke his son's leg. The protagonist, unafraid, reported that it happened during a fight in which he was alone, and on the other side, there were more than 10 people. Thus he questioned why he was the only one arrested. The prosecutor was not at all satisfied with the hero's words, and he immediately ordered that he be taken for interrogation, but those present in the room refused as he was still a minor. But still reluctant, the Four Eyes insisted that they take the protagonist, saying he would handle things himself. With that, the prosecutor was confident that he knew exactly how to deal with delinquents like the protagonist. In a private room, the prosecutor said that Moo-yuk was very famous that day as well. The Four Eyes reported that Moo-yuk's teacher told him everything, including that he was no different from a gang member, causing a lot of trouble in the last year. Now the protagonist harbored a supreme hatred for his abusive teacher. The hero explained that he had no intention of hurting anyone and that he was only defending himself. The prosecutor was already furious with this situation and did not accept the protagonist's answer. Thus he asked once again why he did that. Then Muyek explained that he heard his classmate was dragged by Jinpyo and his gang attacked him when he went to look for him. With no choice, he had to fight. Still not satisfied, the prosecutor took off his belt, saying that this was not enough. And now he was determined to teach the protagonist a lesson. He ordered the two men behind the protagonist to hold him down. And with the protagonist restrained, the cowardly prosecutor began his series of punches. He questioned why the protagonist had done that and continued to beat him. However, Muyek remained firm, saying that it was all in self-defense. The prosecutor said there was some fire inside that delinquent, and that with his next punch, he would extinguish that fire. And once again, the protagonist was mercilessly beaten. The prosecutor's men merely watched, distressed by the devastating situation. After all this chaos, both were exhausted, and the protagonist had a terrible look after so much beating. Still not satisfied, the prosecutor questioned once again why the protagonist did that. Then Muyek, struggling to speak, said again that it was in self-defense. Still insistent, the Four Eyes said that the more Muyek resisted, the worse it would be for him, and so he said he would ask once more. He accused the hero of having attacked his son with a weapon first, but Muyek said he was wrong, as his son was carrying a knife. With even more fury, the prosecutor said that this made him return to his old days, and with that, asked for the protagonist to be tied up. His men were a bit reluctant to obey this order, but under the prosecutor's pressure, they complied. Now the protagonist found himself with his hands stretched out on the table, tied to a chair. The prosecutor said that he had dug his own grave, he was sure of it, and should not be ashamed. With the cowardice of the Four Eyes, he was about to stick a pin under the protagonist's nail. The scoundrel was eager for that, but before he could do it, Muyek began to laugh, which shocked the prosecutor. The scoundrel questioned why the hero started laughing and believed that out of fear, he had lost his sanity. The protagonist said that Jinpyo and his father were very much alike, like father, like son, and he added that both enjoyed waving around their little stupid tools. The prosecutor does not like Muyek's attitude at all, so he asks for him to be held so he can attack him. But to everyone's surprise, a man opens the door looking for the prosecutor. Still angry, the Four Eyes says that this man was interrupting what he was doing there. And suddenly, another tall man enters the room with a serious expression. That man was Yoon Chang-ho, the prosecutor of the Busan district. The scoundrel Four Eyes wondered why Mr. Yoon was there, and without wasting any time, the chief prosecutor slaps Four Eyes in the face, calling him a bastard. He asks him what he was doing with the minor. He continues by saying that if this scoundrel wanted to die, he should die alone without causing any problems. He asks if he knew that the chief prosecutor was almost heading to his future. Still confused, the scoundrel asks why the chief prosecutor was doing all of this. Terrified, the tall man asks if the scoundrel knew who the grandfather of that arrested guy was. But he quickly states that if he knew, he wouldn't be doing that. And so that tall, bald man reveals that it was President Chian of Painong Changdong, who was the grandfather of that guy. Connecting the dots, the coward realizes that it was President Chian Taizan and wonders why he would be involved. And pointing at the protagonist, the chief prosecutor says that that student was the grandson of President Chian, and the cowardly scoundrel, anxiously looking at the protagonist's face, sees that he had a mocking expression, and thus he comes to his senses and panics completely. After all the confusion, the protagonist now found himself at his grandfather's house, and inside, the two were conversing in a serious tone. The old man asked how all of that had happened. The prota said he asked for his help because the prosecutor was conducting an unfair investigation, abusing his power. With seriousness, the bearded man asks if the hero couldn't have avoided that. Then Muyek explains that they involved people close to him, so he couldn't let it slide. So he crushed them so they wouldn't bother him again. Thus he concludes by saying that he doesn't want the people around him to suffer because of him. Therefore, it was his wish to protect all his friends and family. With determination, he says that this was his way of living. The old man just observes, reflecting internally without saying anything. From that, the prota says he already had a great debt to his grandfather. But regarding the matter of protecting his loved ones, he would do anything possible. Still grumpy, the old man asks what the prota would have done if he hadn't helped him. Thus he states that his life could have ended at that moment. The hero says that in that case, his relationship with the old man couldn't go any further. This statement surprises the great loan shark, and with a serious face, the protagonist says that if his grandfather hadn't helped him when he could, he wouldn't see any place for him in his family anymore. And with that last sentence, the old man starts bursting into laughter. And soon after, he states that the protagonist was right, saying that a man should never back down and should use all the methods he could. The protagonist reflects that what he said was serious, however, he learned that this was his grandfather's philosophy of life in his past life. The great loan shark teaches his grandson that, In cases he cannot avoid, he must crush everyone so they won't come back, and a half victory will only give him an excuse to be attacked again. Thus, he concludes by saying that if the Prota wanted to make someone his ally, he should embrace them fully and rid himself of any difficulties. Therefore, the old man calls the director closer to him and asks how things were going in Busan. Mr. He reports that Prosecutor Han was under an internal investigation as he was involved in torture and manipulation, and Prosecutor Yoon was waiting for the old man's decision. Without further ado, the Great Loan Shark asks how things were going at school, and quickly the director reveals that a son of the prosecutor was expelled and all the students involved left. Moreover, the abusive teacher of Muyuk was also expelled, and with all these reports, the old man asks if the protagonist was satisfied with everything. Thus, Muyuk had one more favor to ask of his grandfather. It is revealed that the protagonist would like to take care of Prosecutor Yoon's case, but still confused, his grandfather asks why he wanted to do that. As the day went by, the director and the prosecutor met in a restaurant. Inside, Mr. Ha asked what he planned to do with Prosecutor Hong. Still frightened, the bald young man says that the scoundrel was being investigated and that, to make him an example, they would punish him. The director states that throughout the entire process, the young master's name should never appear. After that, he mentions that there was someone else there interested in speaking with the prosecutor. The director opens the door to the room, and there was the protagonist. They were both already seated facing each other in silence. The prosecutor immediately starts by apologizing for what happened last time, saying it was all his fault and that it would never happen again. But without showing much reaction, Moo-hyuk tells him to speak casually and affirms that he knows the prosecutor's limitations. The old bald man was afraid that the Great Loan Shark would hold a grudge against Moo-hyuk for being his grandson. Thus, the protagonist reveals that he asked his grandfather to have this meeting because he knew the prosecutor was in difficult situations because of him, and he wanted to apologize. The man in the suit begins to get agitated, saying that there was no need to apologize, as everything had been his fault from the beginning for mishandling his subordinates. So Moo-hyuk says he will have to convey a sincere apology from the prosecutor to his grandfather. However, the protagonist was eager to change the subject. Shifting to another topic, the protagonist asks if the prosecutor would guarantee him a favor for another day, without any conditions. He explains that this favor was not to harm him, but rather because only he, in that position, could do it. Yet still nervous, the bald young man agrees to the idea and says he would be happy to help if it was something only he could do. In light of this, the prota says he will direct his apologies to his grandfather and tells him not to take responsibility for this case. Now feeling more stable, the prosecutor says he understands and thanks him, saying he feels lighter with the courtesy. Moo-hyuk says he hopes to meet him under better circumstances and comments that he heard he would be promoted to Seoul. However, the protagonist, already getting up, says he has to go to classes, as he has already missed many days since the incident. With all the conversation going on, the prosecutor had forgotten that Moo-hyuk was just a student and says he hopes to meet him in the future. Finally, the protagonist leaves the room and heads to his commitments. The old man reflects that he was very skilled in dealing with people, considering he was just a high school student. After everything that happened, the protagonist's student life went on without any problems. He continued studying as usual, and his friends were also doing their best, striving for a better future. Time passed with news of war, the Olympics took place, and a new political position was elected. And so the university entrance exam arrived, and the protagonist successfully took the academic proficiency test. In the great mansion of the Loan Shark, Director Hay sets out to report something to the old man. He said he checked the protagonist's admission report through a university professor, generating curiosity in the old man. And as soon as the Great Loan Shark picks up the report, he is surprised by what he sees. The scene cuts to a large crowd of reporters around the protagonist, saying that he passed first in the admission test, achieving a perfect score. They ask how he accomplished this feat. He had achieved a perfect score of 340 points, setting a new record in that region. Many reporters asked what his secret technique was and if he received private tutoring. However, the hero reveals that he never had private lessons and studied only using books. One of those present at the scene tells Moo-hyuk to give some words of encouragement to those who would take the exam next. And so, formally, the prota says that studying was the easiest thing in the world. Returning to the old man's mansion, he was greatly pleased with the result. On one night, after all the events, the boys were at a nightclub, and there they celebrated their achievements and their friendship. The protagonist was annoyed by his friends shouting, but he argued that they had studied for 3 years, so they should have a little fun. Miang's son said that this place belonged to his father, so he would take care of the drinks and the reservation. The hero reflected that, in his past life, he drank many drinks of the best whiskeys available on the market, and so he decided he would drink with them too. It had been a long time since the protagonist had a drink, and he was anxious about what would go down his throat. But upon drinking, he realized that the whiskey was fake. However, Myung's son was already drunk, saying that the sensation burned in his body and questioning how it didn't kill him. The protagonist merely says it wasn't bad at all and that it was like water. Thus, he thinks he should act normally, as that place belonged to his friend's father. Suddenly, a young man arrives, introducing a very beautiful girl to Myung-sun, saying she was the most beautiful among his clients. He ends up saying to take good care of her, but the two friends of the hero were already blushing. The girls were already sitting with the boys, chatting. One of them asks Muyuk how old he is and claims she is 21. Myung-sun was already excited and says they are 20 years old and were accepted into college just a few days ago, and the girl asks which university. But when he was about to speak, the protagonist silences him, saying they would be going to a small college in Seoul. Suddenly, some con artists approached the boys' table, asking what they were doing. The scoundrel wondered why the women hadn't returned after going to the bathroom, and he was confronted with them leaving with younger guys. The girl complained that she could no longer go to that place because the crowd was horrible. She said she left the room without any drink and that the man should have noticed she didn't like his piggish face. The scoundrel said he was going crazy and wondered what that idiot was doing. The protagonist was already alert, being careful not to get into unnecessary trouble, and presumed it would be best to leave quickly. The hero stands up from the table and says they are leaving and apologizes. But as soon as the protagonist looks at his friend Myung-soo, telling him to get up, he realizes something was wrong with him. Suddenly, the kid freaks out and starts shouting that he didn't care about anything anymore. The scoundrels who were already bothering them became furious at Myung-soo's reaction. Muyuk was worried about his drunk friend. However, Myung-soo saw nothing wrong, as they were just there to drink. Thus, Myung-soo says he would ruin his father's business by doing this, but the protagonist says it was enough and they should leave soon. As the boys were leaving, a glass is thrown to the ground. The fat scoundrel who threw it asks where they thought they were going. One of the staff tries to calm him down, saying those boys were the son and friends of the owner of the place and that they were just there to celebrate his graduation. But ignoring him, the fat man throws the staff member to the ground, calling him a bastard. With that, the scoundrel starts kicking the poor guy on the ground, asking if he thought he was a joke. Seeing the scene, all the customers in the place began to run away. The suited boys who were with the fat man start trying to stop him, asking why he was acting that way. One of the men asks Lee if he doesn't know they took over Napodon. They had been solving things with that guy, providing whiskey to them for a long time. Now the protagonist was already aware of the person selling the fake whiskey. The owner of the place says his son remains immature and caused problems, thus apologizing and saying he will take care of everything. Myung-soo's father tells the boys to get out of there quickly and for his son to wait for him at home. The hero, downcast, tells them to hurry up. The fat scoundrel was still yelling, asking where they were going, but the owner tells him to lead them out of it and resolve it among themselves. Suddenly, the main group hears the loud sound of a slap and becomes alert. The obese scoundrel asked if Mr. Lee was mocking him and added that he had always respected him for being older, but he shouldn't act that way, and now the roles had reversed. The fat man said the old man was being outsmarted by a younger guy, and with that, he starts kicking him, saying he should have treated him better when he was being nice. Furious at seeing his father getting beaten, Myung-soo charges at the scoundrel, but got no results, being easily subdued by the giant and thrown to the ground right after. Now holding the kid by the hair, the fat man said he would teach him a big lesson, saying that if he messes with someone he doesn't know, he will be beaten up. Now on his knees, the owner of the place begs Mr. Byung to stop and let his son go. Ironically, the pig says that the love of his father for his son was making him cry. With that, he releases Myung-soo and goes to slap the owner, saying it was as he wished. But quickly, he is stopped, having his arm immobilized. Muyuk finally acted, saying that it was enough and that he was going too far. The big guy didn't understand how his arm had been stopped. The hero says that no matter how angry he was, he should never hit a father in front of his child, and adds that he had already done enough and should stop. Still frustrated, the scoundrel wondered if kids these days had no fear anymore. And now, moving to try to hit Muyuk, he asked if he didn't know who he was, acting that way in front of him. When he tried to hit the protagonist, who easily dodged, he was surprised but didn't show any reaction. At that moment, the scoundrel's friends were already ready to face the protagonist. But suddenly, one of his men flew past him. As the big brute tried to process what was happening, he received a hard slap to the face. With that, he fell to the ground dazed, while Muyuk watched. Mysteriously, a figure waved to Muyuk, who was surprised to see it was Park Dong-soo. The punk that the protagonist had encountered at the hospital was there to help them, asking if he had fun while he was away. Facing the scoundrel, Park wondered how that idiot hadn't been captured yet, thinking he was such a sneaky criminal that even the police couldn't find him. The brute's reaction upon seeing Dong-soo was to say that this was his territory at that moment. With that, the punk approached the scoundrel, saying that Nampodong hadn't belonged to him before. Hostile towards his opponent, Dong-soo said he was there now, and seriously told him to get lost before he broke his face, causing the brute to start sweating cold. Then he greeted the protagonist, asking how he had been and saying it was good to see him again. Happy with the hero's presence, Park invited him for a drink of soju. In a room with just the two of them, Dong-soo commented that he saw the news where the protagonist was ranked first in the country, adding that he didn't expect that from him. Muhyuk asked when he had returned, and Park replied that it had been a while, but he was taking time to discreetly reclaim the old territories. The protagonist asked if the delinquent managed the area, and he replied that yes, because all of it belonged to them. Despite that, he hadn't faced major fights to take them. Park Dong-soo commented that his last gang had been wiped out, and he added that if the protagonist hadn't warned him, he would have been in prison for many years, and so he thanked him. Suddenly, Park asked the protagonist what he wanted from him at that moment. With that, he explained that his life had been saved by the hero and he should repay him for it, as he couldn't live in debt to him. The protagonist gave a gentle smile, implying that he was aware of the situation. The protagonist questioned the delinquent, asking how long he thought it would take to take control of the entire area of Busan. Dong-soo, not understanding, asked if he was being questioned about that when he asked what he wanted, since the protagonist was worrying about someone else's business. But the protagonist replied seriously that that was what he wanted now. Park responded that it would take around 6 months, and at most a year. Since everyone had been arrested, only people of little relevance remained. The protagonist simply replied for him to take control of Busan soon and make sure to bribe the police and prosecutors and handle things carefully. And he added to not get involved with drugs, as they would soon crack down on it in an unprecedented way. Even with connections, it would be hard to manage. With that, the protagonist told him to prepare for the transition from the shadows to the light of day. The delinquent laughed at the protagonist's last phrase and found it ironic. From that, he said that people like them never appeared in the light of day, as they would find someone like him emerging from the shadows and starting a new war. The protagonist said that it was regrettable and asked if he would obey all the laws. What was the point of being a gangster? Park argued that the Seo gangs had started the process of becoming a corporation, and that Busan needed to hurry, or else the Seoul gangs would prevail. The hero told him to hire competent lawyers and start his corporation, and after taking control of Busan, he should advance to Seoul. Dong-soo was astonished to hear Muhyuk mention Seo. He argued excitedly that it wasn't that easy, as that place was a battlefield where people from all over the country would come to fight, but calmly. The protagonist told him not to worry, as he would help him, and told him to trust him, as he would make the preparations. Now calmer, the delinquent says that it was ridiculous, but he still felt very convinced by the protagonist's speech. Now more animated, the gangster says that it didn't sound bad, and that he would try to take control of Seoul. They served themselves once again, filling their glasses with expensive whiskey. Muhyuk now said that there was a condition for all of this to happen. He reveals that in this process, his name and identity should never be revealed, nor his connection to Park Dong-soo, under any circumstances. Soon after, he swallows some of his whiskey and reflects that he couldn't have anyone knowing who he was, not until he fought against the Chin family, now inside his grandfather's mansion. At the president's house, the old man was reading a newspaper article about the protagonist saying that studying was the easiest thing. He bursts into laughter with happiness for his grandson. The director beside him asks if he is happy, and the old man replies that yes, because in addition to a family member entering Korea University, he was also among the best in the country. The loan shark said he felt so invigorated talking to the old man from the Samsung group on duty that morning. The old man knew that they usually belittled them, thinking that his family was nothing more than ignorant people with money, and they always bragged about their children. The director states that those same people who said that also came to ask the president for loans. The old man knows that this is true, as they belittled him behind his back, but when they needed something, they came begging for hours. He recounts that he didn't finish elementary school because he had to work, and that his children also weren't good students without his money. They wouldn't have made it to college. The director mentions Jisoo, the president's second daughter, who managed to enter Korea University last year, thus making the president give 1% of Samsung Electronics shares as a gift. The white-bearded man agrees, saying that Jisoo was a smart child. He said he really liked Muhyuk and wondered how great he would be if he weren't his grandson, but rather a direct descendant with the Chien surname. Now the old man asks what the news says about the newly elected president, and the director replies that he is focused on selecting the members of the committee. The suited young man says that the president managed to secure part of 2 positions, and thus he didn't understand. The director continues to saying that now it was a civilian government. Asking for too much would be strange. However, the old man had already understood and tells him not to say anything more. At that moment, the old man asks which positions the director thought were best. He replies that placing someone in charge of economic and political affairs would be good. The loan shark asks him to explain more about the political affairs. The shaved-head man says that political affairs would manipulate the police and the prosecution. That would be very useful. In light of this, the president says they will do that, as they will go directly to the Blue House, and the director agrees. Now the old man asks what Suhan and Suman had been doing these days. The director reveals that the second chief was preparing a new venture, but there was a problem. He reports that this new business was linked to gangsters. Upon hearing this, the old man freaks out as he hated gangsters. Frightened, the big loan shark asks if most gangs hadn't been detained against war or crime, but the man in black says it was a gang that was secretly growing. The old man already knew the history of this gang called the Blue Wind Society. He questions what the hell they were doing involved with them. The director says they were involved in the slot machine business. The big loan shark gets furious and asks if that was the best they could do, just gambling. The shaved head man reveals that Congressman Kim had been bribed and that his father-in-law was leading the licensing process, thus securing a lot of funds. Still disgusted, the loan shark says he should be doing tasks for those damned in-laws, as he had warned them in advance not to get involved with that society. With seriousness, the director asks how they should deal with that. But the old man says that for now, it would be good to just keep an eye on them so they wouldn't cause problems. Now the white-haired man reflected that he should never have borrowed power from the Blue Wind Society in his youth. Now he was clearly scared by this fact, but also relieved. He reflected that all of this was the result of his own karma and assured that before he died, he would break this chain of bad fate. At the loan shark's mansion, the atmosphere was pleasant with the sun in the sky, and at the entrance, there was a young man calling for his grandfather. This young man with good posture was Muyek, who was back. His grandfather welcomed him with a smile on his face and said it was good to have him back, and face to face with him, revealed that he had been waiting for him. Now the two were sitting in the main room, and the old man asked if the Prota had found a place to live in Seoul. The loan shark said he would get an apartment near the Prota's college and would also hire a maid so that he could focus solely on his studies. But the hero revealed that he would like to stay at his grandfather's house if he didn't mind. Continuing, he said that since the first time he visited that house, he had always wanted to live there. He argued that his mother lived there when she was young, so he would feel closer to her if he stayed there, and added that he would like to see his grandfather more often. The old man was very pleased to hear that, saying that he was good at saying things that pleased him, and told him to do as he wished. In the Prota's past life, he only went to that house when he was called, and he never participated in the gatherings, being treated as a stranger. But at that moment, he had been accepted into the law school of the best university, and it was a source of pride for his grandfather, so naturally, he would be treated differently. Now sipping his tea, the old man, curious, asked the hero to tell him. He died having fulfilled his promise of being accepted into the law school of Korea University 3 years ago, and the old man wanted to know what he would like to receive as a gift. The Prota gave a confident smile, knowing he had the old man in his hands. Now he said that Grandpa must have been very curious since he called him right after the graduation ceremony, and the old man said that the Prota's achievements were not something that could be achieved just by wanting. Now the fool said that there was no way not to be curious, since he had worked so hard for his studies, and now he wanted to know what he wanted. In response, the protagonist revealed that he would like to learn more about his grandfather's work. With this revelation, the old man and the director were completely stunned, not saying a word. Still in disbelief, the old man asked if that was really what he wanted, if it was about learning how he worked, and with that, Muyek confirmed that yes, that was what he desired. The white head asked if he was saying this, being aware of the kind of work he did, since private loans were not just about lending and collecting money. Confident, the hero said he didn't know much about that, but he was sure that the work he did was not something common, which is why he wanted to learn more. The old man was still confused and spent some time in thought. Muyek reflected on what he needed to take his grandfather's fortune and take revenge on the rest, and he wondered what he should ask him. He reflected between money, people, or properties, and actions that would increase in value vertically. But using the knowledge he had of the future, making money was not a problem. However, if he accumulated wealth that way, he would eventually be exposed, and his uncles would try to control him. In this regard, the Prota still did not have the strength or power to protect himself, and the funds he needed to fight, his uncles had hidden. And now his plan was to pretend, learn by working with his grandfather to win his heart, and then manipulate him at his pleasure. The great loan shark wanted to confirm once again his grandson would like to learn about his work with him, and soon after he asked if he considered this a reward for a bet that lasted 3 years, since he could ask for something much bigger that he could have now. In response, the protagonist argued that learning to fish instead of receiving the fish ready would be better for him. Lowering his head seriously, the old man reflected for a moment, and now he asked the director what he thought. The man in black said it was too early. They should wait for the Prota to graduate from university. Impatient, Muyek said he didn't have a strong attachment to academia and would like to start right at that moment. The old man adopted a serious tone and said that the Prota was going to Korea University and asked if he wasn't trying to become a judge or a lawyer. But the hero revealed that entering university was just a means to prove his ability to his grandfather. Muyek said he wanted to become someone with great power like his grandfather. Hearing this left the great loan shark thoughtful, and he did not say another word. However, still serious, the prota said that if his grandfather wanted him to become a lawyer, he would follow that, as he was ready to take the bar exam whenever needed. The white-bearded man says that the protagonist implied that by taking the bar exam, he would be served on a silver platter for him. Director Ha reflected that this man was truly unpredictable and wondered if he had a much greater capacity than he imagined. Now the great loan shark was determined and said that the protagonist should move forward and try. The president ordered the director to teach his work to the hero. Now inside a closed room, sitting at a table, were the man in black and the protagonist. The director begins by saying that the president was involved in a loan business and reveals that these were private loans, or as they say, loan sharking. And even if they were private, they were still being operated within the law. Thus, the director instructs the protagonist to study the law thoroughly, as they needed fail-proof guarantees. These guarantees could be real estate or various types of securities, and they also accepted stocks, but only those that could affect the company's shares. The president personally dealt with large conglomerates, helping with funds and amounts, and said that banks could not handle it, moving tens of billions daily. The protagonist reflects that, at that time, the large banks had not developed, and Myeongdong and his grandfather were practically the center of the financial business. Now the director tells him to learn the negotiation process where the president deals with the conglomerates, and for that, he should read several books on the subject. A huge pile of books and documents is placed in front of the protagonist, making him a bit startled. The man in a suit says that these were the books and contracts and the legal materials regarding the guarantees they currently had, and thus instructs the protagonist to read all of them over 3 days and then send a summary. The protagonist felt a bit embarrassed as he already knew all those things, but still had to pretend. A week later, at the old man's mansion, he asked what the director thought of the protagonist after teaching him. The shaved head reveals that the protagonist was capable of seeing the flow of money and finding hidden patterns in various documents. In his opinion, it would take a lot of experience to have these skills, but the hero developed them as if he already knew everything. The old man, upon hearing this, tries not to show a reaction, but he was convinced that his grandson had great talent. In this process, the director reveals that they found corporate representatives, and with that, the protagonist did not feel intimidated at all, being quite natural. Continuing, he says that he did not need to help the hero at all. Thus, these words were like honey to the old man's ears. In light of this, the director argues that the protagonist could learn all the tasks he could teach him in a few days. Suddenly, the great loan shark asks if he could put Muyuk in charge of the Myeongdong operations. The shaved head is startled and asks if it wasn't a bit early, and also wonders if the Myeongdong bosses would recognize the protagonist. The white-bearded man, confident, argues that he had entrusted his work to the protagonist and questions why he would need their recognition. The director counters by saying that even Presidents Chien Suman and Suhan had difficulty dealing with those guys and wondered if the young master would be capable. The president says that eventually they would have to face them, and it would be better to do it sooner rather than later, and asks to gather all the banking books from Myeongdong. Now the old man was very anxious to see what the protagonist would be capable of doing and whether he would be of any use to them. Now in a very luxurious corporate building, one of his sons received a call, and it was revealed to him that the protagonist was going to Myeongdong. He hangs up the phone silently as if he were very doubtful. Thus he begins to look thoughtfully at the city from the top of his building. He reflected on his father's intentions with that young man. In the great city of Seoul, traffic flowed smoothly and the sunlight was pleasant. The protagonist and the director were inside the car, and the hero asked what kind of business the long-haired man had in Myeongdong. He replied that the 5 major banks were concentrated in Myeongdong. Then the loan market formed in that area, with the main presidents of the conglomerates taking care of it. But Chang Su-man and Su-han took care of other smaller areas. The director continued by saying that besides those two, there were 4 people known as the 4 heads of Myeongdong. They were the largest private lenders in Myeongdong, moving tens and hundreds of millions daily. He went on to say that the president trusted them with his money as an investor, so the protagonist should check if they were managing all the funds properly. Now with a more serious tone, Mr. Hess said that those guys had been in the business for a long time, so it wouldn't be easy to deal with them. Even so, the protagonist was very distrustful, saying it was no problem, as he would have to face them one day, and it would be better if it were early to learn. The director is surprised by the hero's response, and he remains silent. At that time, the loan industry was filled with cruel people, whom even the gangster feared, and these people included the 4 loan shark bosses of Myeongdong. These same individuals had maintained their positions for decades and earned the trust of the great loan shark Chung. That is why they were formidable individuals. However, the protagonist had also grown up in this field in his past life. In addition to having died because of it, Upon reaching their destination, the boys are greeted by one of the 4 lone shark bosses, who welcomes them. Friendly, he says he was looking forward to their visit and asks if the president is well. The director replies that he is and asks how he has been. With that, he is introduced to the president's grandson, our protagonist. Muyep bows his head, waving at him and introducing himself. The great boss extends his hand to the hero and introduces himself as Kim Ho-shik, saying it is a pleasure to meet him. The boss comments that he knew the protagonist had entered Korea University and says he also graduated from the same university. Maintaining appearances, the protagonist says he is eager to work with such a great man. This person, who was a private lender who graduated from Korea University, gave up his university diploma just to pursue a career in that field on his own. Continuing on, the protagonist sits down and first asks for the ledger. Still confident, the great man asks if he is already starting and tells him to take it easy, thus encouraging him to have some tea. The protagonist, unfazed, says he is not used to that, so it might take a while. He would like to start with the ledger. After that, he hands over the ledger and thanks him. The protagonist begins to read attentively, taking all the time in the world. Once again, the boss offers a coffee for the protagonist to drink while he analyzes and says he is confident there will be no mistakes, as he graduated in business administration. The hero was a bit shaken, reflecting that the ledger was meticulously organized, but something was wrong, as that Kim Ho-shik he knew was not meticulous at all. With that, the protagonist says the ledger was impeccably organized and asks for the bank statements. Kim Ho-shik discreetly signs to one of his servants without saying anything. After a while, the protagonist had already analyzed the bank statements placed on the table. Thus, his verdict was that 12 of them were correct, and the boss says those statements were the most important, as they could not afford to lose any. The protagonist continues to thank Kim Ho-shik for all the effort he made and says he would take all of that with him. But upon hearing this, the great man becomes furious. The protagonist continues, saying that the president instructed him to recover all the bank books managed by him, but that person could not believe the president ordered that. Now Kim Ho-shik was sweating cold, reflecting that the president was indeed tampering with the bank books. Thus the boss questions, saying he could not just recover them suddenly, and asks if it was really an order from the president. In a more serious tone, the hero says he has no reason to lie to him, and if he has doubts, he can call Pyeongchang-don right then. Continuing, the protagonist asks if there is any reason the bank books could not be recovered, and if there is, he should say so at that very moment. Now a bit awkward, Ho-shik says there is no problem at all. He was just surprised it was so sudden. Thus, the hero says he needs to speak with that great man privately. Kim's men approach with stern faces, trying to intimidate the protagonist. Suddenly, Director Hay starts shouting, ordering the others to obey the protagonist's command to leave the room. The grim men remain silent, but now a bit apprehensive. The protagonist and the director just observe the unfolding of that scene. But suddenly, the great Kim Ho-shik stands up and slaps one of his men. He says they should not dare to have that kind of attitude in front of the young master, as they did not understand simple words. And now, furious, he orders them to get out of his sight as quickly as possible. Now everyone was out of the room waiting for the conversation between the two to finish. A bit calmer, the boss laments the ignorance of those who had no sense and asks the protagonist to understand. At that moment, lighting a cigarette, he asks why he is so serious for a private chat. Suddenly, Muyek stands up with an intimidating look and says that since that man was a servant, he should act like one. Now in complete control of the situation, the protagonist said that the young man didn't know how to read the room and was so stupid that he couldn't tell the difference between dung and soybean paste. Kim Ho-shik, who couldn't believe what he was hearing, was perplexed. He stands up, furious, shouting that the protagonist was a little bastard who was nobody in life. But now the protagonist raised his voice once again, shouting for Kim Ho-shik to sit down. The men outside the room hear the shouting and are anxious to know what was going on inside. Moments earlier, while the protagonist was in the car with the director, he was asking for a favor. Mr. Ha asks him to explain what he meant. Thus, the hero reveals that when he was alone with Mr. Kim Ho-shik in the room, regardless of what the director heard, he was not to enter. Still rational, the long-haired man said he wasn't sure the protagonist would be okay, as that man was not easy. In response, the protagonist said that if he couldn't handle people like him, he wouldn't be able to face the presidents of future corporations. And following his orders, the president listened to everything outside the room, but did not intervene at all. The protagonist now told Ho-shik not to be tough and argued that he already knew he was tampering with the bank books, but understood that he did it to make a living, so to some extent, he could turn a blind eye. The man's expression was one of complete despair, as he was very anxious. Now the protagonist, furious, said that he couldn't be messing with the president's secret account. The hero, outraged, questioned why that jerk hadn't brought him the book of the secret account. The boss was already sweating cold, wondering how Mori knew about the secret account, since only he and the president knew. And with that, the protagonist was convinced that he had caught Kim Hoshik. Kim Hoshik continued to be anxious in front of the protagonist, who demanded his grandfather's secret notebooks. The protagonist was sure that those notebooks were being managed by him and wouldn't back down, continuing to ask for them. It was entrusted to the 4 main bosses of Mindong, a notebook, with accounts made under a name that didn't even exist. These held 1 trillion wons each, totaling 4 trillion, as discovered by the protagonist while searching for the hidden money after his grandfather's death. However, when the real name law was implemented, the 4 trillion wons had already vanished, and Kim Hoshik was happily using that money to pay his bills. Now the hero asked the boss why he was so shocked and presumed that he thought he wouldn't know about this matter. Completely distressed, Hoshik reflected that only he and the president knew about this notebook and wondered if the president had told the protagonist. Once again, Muyuk urged that man to bring what he was asking for quickly. Given this issue, the boss asked for a little time while stumbling over his words, but the hero remained serious and said that this was not something that needed time. Confident in his actions, the protagonist sat in his chair and said that if he didn't bring it in 10 minutes, he would have no choice but to report everything to the president. Still in shock, Kim pleaded for Muyuk to wait at least a month, making this request as a favor. Upon hearing that a favor was being offered at that moment, Muyuk reflected. After that, he replied that this was not how one should ask for a favor. At that moment, Kim Hoshik couldn't hide his expression of despair. In light of this, he stood up from his chair and begged Muyuk to wait at least a month. To convince him further, he bowed before the protagonist, asking for time. Now determined, Muyuk told him that he had 2 weeks to prepare everything and not a single penny should be missing. And with his air of superiority, he asked if the boss understood. The one looking down at the protagonist felt relieved. In response, the hero said that they should keep the matter of that day between them and that Hoshik should be careful not to let other bosses know about it. Once again, the protagonist asked if he understood, and with a trembling voice, Kim replied that he did. Now adopting a friendlier tone, Muyuk said that he had no problem with the book, Razao, or the bank statements. Leaving the room, the protagonist said he would return to follow up on what was missing in 2 weeks. Outside, he came face to face with 3 men waiting for him. These were the same ones who were servants of the boss and did not seem to be in a good mood about the situation. But upon seeing this scene, director Hay shouts for them to clear the way. The tough guys who were trying to intimidate Muyuk tremble in fear at the shout. Thus, the 2 continued their walk out of the building. Quickly, the 3 goofballs rush into the room to check on how their boss was doing. But there he was, covered in fear, wondering if that boy was just an ordinary kid, as he was completely different from what they had said. Another day passed, and now at the mansion of the Great Lone Shark, the old man was asking how the meeting went. Director Hare reported that the protagonist received the book, Razao, and all 12 bank statements with fake names, and he would also receive reports to be made every 2 weeks. The old man asked if there were any other problems with Muyuk and Hoshik. However, the long-haired man said that at first, Kim treated the protagonist as a subordinate. Thus, he added that after their conversation, the young master left the room very confident. These reports made the Great Lone Shark thoughtful. With that, he asked who was next, and Mr. Hay said they planned to visit No Iction. The old man thanked the director for his work and told him to take a break, which he complied with. With that, the president picked up his phone to make a call. He had called Kim Hoshik and started by asking how it had gone and how the protagonist was doing. But Hoshik stumbled over his words and took a while to respond. Once again, the old man asked and questioned the reason for the silence. The report that Kim gave him was that compared to Presidents Suman and Suhan, the protagonist resembled the old man a lot. The great Qian asked to confirm if that was really what he thought. After that, the president asked what they had discussed privately, and once again, Kim Hoshik let silence take over. Already stressed, the old man said he didn't like to ask twice and questioned again about what they had talked about. However, Kim opened his mouth, saying that Muyuk mentioned the secret bank accounts that had been entrusted to him. Thus, the president was startled, widening his eyes. He reflected on how Muyuk had discovered that. After a long silence, the old man asked if there was anything else. Hoshik reported that he agreed to deliver them in 2 weeks and asked if he should really do that. And the president agreed, telling him to deliver them. But there was a catch, the president said. Hoshik, who was in his office scared, awaited the old man's response. Now he was receiving a lecture from the president for raising his voice at his grandson. The scoundrel said he was very sorry and promised it would never happen again. The great Qian made it clear that he was just a servant who got rich, and that it didn't mean he could sit at the same table as the boss. And now calmer, the white-bearded man told him not to forget who helped him get to that position. Sweating cold, Hoshik said he would keep that in mind. After that, the president hung up the phone in silence. and he reflected on how the protagonist discovered the secret notebooks he had entrusted to the heads of Myeongdong. He also didn't understand why he asked for them to be delivered. Continuing, he thought that neither Suman nor Suhan knew about the accounts, and moreover, he wondered how Muyuk convinced them to be handed over to him. The old man remembered Kim's words saying that the protagonist resembled him a lot, and with that information, he felt very pleased. Another night passed at the mansion of the Great Loan Shark. The protagonist reflected that he knew Kim Hoshik's weakness and wondered if the other heads of Myeongdong had tampered with that same bank notebook. He was worried about the 400 billion in the orange account that would disappear after the implementation of the real name financial transaction system. Still restless, the protagonist wanted to get his hands on that money without anyone finding out, as it would be a strong support for his fight against the Chien brothers. But soon he concluded that there was no way to get that money before the real name system was announced. The next day, in the office of one of the bosses, the checking accounts and other documents were laid out on the table. After reviewing them, the hero said everything was fine and that he would be checking the accounts every 2 weeks and would also take the bank books. With that, he asked the boss if he agreed. In-sok, one of the big bosses, agreed with the young master. Without wasting time, the protagonist asked if that gentleman had any other bank book that belonged to the president. The boss tried to play dumb about the president's notebook. Seeing In-sok's reaction, the protagonist interpreted that Kim Hoshik hadn't told that man anything. Once again, the hero asks if the boss had a notebook that the president secretly handed to him, justifying that he himself asked him to take it. Still sweating cold, the boss says that only he and the president knew about that, so he would have to confirm with him first. The protagonist tries to sweeten his words, saying that he could trust him, and that the mere fact that he knew about the notebook meant that the president wanted it. Judging by the reaction of the two bosses, Muyuk thinks that the money did not disappear when the new system was implemented and wonders if they were hiding the money. The protagonist reflected that all the bosses had huge lending companies in Myeongdong thanks to his grandfather, and yet they betrayed him. At that moment, Muyuk asks the man if he needed more time. Still frightened, the boss promises to deliver in 2 weeks but soon reduces it to just 1 week. Upon hearing this, the hero feels relieved and even lets out a small sigh. Full of himself, the protagonist says he would wait for a week and that he would not report anything to his grandfather. He knew that his grandpa had done a lot for those men, but tampering with the bank book was already going too far. The protagonist says with a mocking tone that his grandfather was still very healthy and warns that man to be careful. He argues that when a dog bites its owner, you cannot let that go by quietly. Later that day, the protagonist heads to another boss. He reads the bank notes attentively, but still suspiciously. The man he was visiting this time was Shin Sungul, a wrestling champion whom his grandfather supported since childhood. For this reason, he was the boss who was most loyal to the old loan shark. With this, the protagonist had already finished checking the bank books and the ledgers completely. Continuing with the inspection, the hero asks to be handed the president's secret bank book. To Muyuk's surprise, the wrestler doesn't hesitate and quickly goes to fetch the president's records. He starts by moving towards a portrait of the president, and upon moving the portrait, a hidden safe in the wall is revealed. The big wrestler hands over the secret notebook without hesitation and kindly. This makes the protagonist reflect that he did not embezzle any money, which was expected of him, as there was a reason for his grandfather to trust him. Outside the building, they were already saying goodbye in front of his vehicle. The giant said he was looking forward to the next meetings and bowed to the young master. The protagonist said that next time they would meet in a more comfortable place. With that, they sped off down the road. The last boss they were to look for was the gentleman and the giant, who among the 4 bosses had the most experience. This boss, unlike the others who learned from the protagonist's grandfather and became independent, was a loan shark who competed with the Great Chien in the lending market during the 1970s. Thus, director had asked if the hero knew the nickname of Mr. Yu Jigang. The protagonist was already aware of the situation, saying that he obviously knew. He was a man who single-handedly defeated the gangsters who tried to dominate the lending market of Myeongdong. He was known as the Hammer President Yu Jigang. Now inside his office, he was completely focused on his tasks with a serious look. After noticing the presence of the two in his office, he tells them to wait just a minute, and he offers them a seat in his office, telling them to wait a little longer. Director Head did not like his attitude, judging it disrespectful and tending to confront him. But the protagonist remains calm and interrupts the long-haired man before he can do anything. The hero sits down to wait while the last boss does not take his eyes off his paperwork. Then time passed and the hours they were in that office were stretching on. Finally, Jigang stands up from his chair, which makes the protagonist and the director feel anxious about what was coming. He approaches the two, apologizing for making them wait so long. He explains that with the ledger he needed to report to the president, He had to get ahead and clean it up properly, which is why it took a little time. Now with a mocking tone, he asks if the young master is not upset. In short words, the protagonist only says that he would take a look at the documents. Adopting an offensive tone, Jigang says that director Hoi must have been working a lot lately. He continues by saying that changing diapers while taking care of the child was complicated, but the protagonist does not show any reaction to that. Without tiring, the boss said that the president was being too harsh with him, as he was not really suited for that job, so it should be difficult for him. Being even bolder, he said that if he couldn't train the protagonist, he should send him over whenever he wanted, as he would train him from A to Z in that case. Staying firm, the director simply told Jigang to be careful with his words, as that was the president's grandson. But without wavering, this figure did not understand why he should be careful with a child, as just calling him young master should be enough. Trying to offend them, he said that old cosplays like those were more suitable for loyal people like the director, thus telling him not to try to impose that on him, as he had been in the business for years. Now trying to insult the protagonist directly, he asked if he even knew what he was looking at in his hands, and asked why he didn't just pass it to the director to stop wasting time. The hero reflected that that way of provoking him was very childish, but he simply replied that he was almost done. There was nothing wrong with the accounting books, which could already be strange in itself, but in any case that didn't matter. Now the protagonist argued that there was nothing wrong with the ledger, and at that moment he asked for the secret notebook to be handed over. But the boss did not understand why he would do that. The protagonist explained that the president asked him to fetch it, and once again proving his rudeness, Jigang blew all the smoke from his cigarette in the protagonist's face. Then he exclaimed that the president should go there personally, and he argued that this was the right thing to do, as he entrusted that to him personally, so he shouldn't return it unless it was personally as well. After that, he asked if the protagonist did not agree with his argument. A tense atmosphere had settled in the room that housed those men. The director, already furious, said that President Yu was going too far with his jokes. But he said he would never joke when it came to work, and thus was just teaching the young master. He argued to him that in business, formalities should be precise, and asked if the director had not taught such things to the protagonist. And now more offensively, the scared one asked if the director had not been taking everything a bit too lightly lately. The director did not like hearing that at all, and was about to hurt someone. But the hero calmed him down, asking him to wait outside for a moment. The protagonist was confident and asked Ted to get some fresh air outside. With that, he complied and said it was all right. Now the protagonist and the scared one were alone in the room, in complete silence. Muryuk, who was already fed up with the delay, told him to hand over the secret bank book. The reaction of the long-haired one with the scar was one of surprise, saying he couldn't believe they told him that, and said that the president was planning to trust him a lot. But still, he did not care about that and continued asking for the president to come personally so he could hand it over. But to everyone's surprise, Muryuk shouted with all his might the name of the president, Yu Jigang, the very one who hated being shouted at, and asked how he dared to do such an act. At that moment, the president snapped, saying that since before the protagonist was born, it was he who protected the president, walking through Myeongdong and cleaning up his messes, and a kid like that could not lift his head and respond to him. He continued saying that the only person who could give him orders would be the president himself, and that none of his children could command him. Still extremely furious, he said that it was not just because the protagonist shared the same blood as the president that he would be on the same level as him. Given this situation, the hero stood up, shouting once again the name of the president, and the reaction that Yu had was to put his hands on his hammer. He said he had saved the president countless times with that hammer, and many thugs had invaded the office and had their heads smashed by that hammer. That utensil was the history of Myeongdong, the living proof of the loan shark market, thus advising Muryuk not to mess with him. Now the protagonist understood that the president wanted to go all the way with this. Still ridiculing Muryuk, the president said that he wouldn't even know how the end of that business was, and also knew nothing about that world. The protagonist reflected that the president was trying to assert dominance, but was still being very excessive, and wondered where that confidence came from. Muryuk was sure that Yu Jigang was not in a position to rebel against his grandfather. Now there was a doubt in the protagonist's mind that there was something he didn't know, and this kept hammering in his head like a new uncertainty. Continuing, the protagonist argues that he would give the president a day to prepare all the bank statements, and if things continued this way, he wouldn't let it slide. And so he walks toward the door to leave the room. But just as he was about to exit, he hears the president calling him. And there he was, behind him, about to strike him on the head with a hammer. The protagonist has no reaction and simply waits for the worst to happen. But just as the blow was about to land, President Yu had stopped before even hitting him. Now he had a look of surprise on his face, but the hammer still pointed at the hero. A bit flustered, he said that in the protagonist's blood there was still a bit of the president's courage, and he remarked that he thought the protagonist would wet himself. Now aiming to insult the president, Muyuk asks why he was swinging that hammer if he didn't even have the courage to hit someone in front of him. He continues arguing that the moment he attacked, he would also die, and asks if he thought that bluff would scare him. Still relentless and full of confidence, the protagonist tells Yu Jigang to have all the notebooks ready by tomorrow if he wanted to live. And as he exits through the door, the hero says that if he tried that again, he should be prepared to have his head crushed. President Yu becomes furious, his nerves frayed, but he says nothing. Some time later, inside the car, the protagonist and the director were returning from their trip. The long-haired man asked what had happened, as he thought there had been a commotion earlier. The protagonist, who was notably too calm, said it was nothing serious, just the president trying to smash his head with a hammer. The car suddenly brakes sharply in the middle of the road. The director couldn't come to terms with the words and couldn't believe what had happened, asking if the protagonist was okay. A line of cars was forming behind their car, causing a massive traffic jam. The protagonist simply replied that they were in the middle of the road, blocking the rest. At that moment, they had already arrived at the great mansion of the Lone Shark King. The old man demanded the reports from the last meeting with Yu Jigang. The director reported that he insisted the president himself come to collect the bank notebooks. The white-haired man knew there was more to that conversation and asked what the continuation was. Ha informed him that they also tried to hit the young master on the head with the hammer. However, he quickly added that the protagonist was fine. The old man wondered why Jigang had acted that way. The director also didn't understand the reason, as since arriving in Mindong, he had competed with the great lone shark, but he had never acted like that before. It seemed quite strange that day. The long-haired man argued that it was as if he were trying to provoke them on purpose. Chien said that Director Hay could handle this matter personally. Thus, he should decide how to deal with it and ensure there were no problems. Given this, the long-haired man said he understood and would do his best. The scowling president was in his car on a phone call saying it wasn't a big deal, and he added that the protagonist was just a kid and only tried to give him a little scare. Jigang said he wasn't as impressive as he thought, and the president's judgment seemed to be diminishing in his perception. But suddenly, a speeding truck was about to crash into the back of his car, and the worst happened, with the president getting into an accident suddenly. After that, sometime later, in an underground room, Jigang was tied up and gagged, not understanding anything. In front of him was the shadow of a man with a murderous aura, and this large man revealed himself to be Director He. President Yu now began to tremble with fear, unable to say a word. Now he realized that the director was holding a hammer in his hand, which made him panic even more. Swinging the hammer, the large man said they should have a little chat. The president struggled while tied up, shaking his feet desperate. He pointed the hammer at the director without saying a word to intimidate him. Calmly, he removed the cloth covering Yu's mouth. Quickly, the president began shouting that the director could never get away with that behavior. But unfazed, the large man simply asked if he had tried to hurt the young master with that hammer. And, in silence, he raised the hammer and brought it toward the scoundrel's face. But before he could strike, the director stopped. The intimidating hammer was hovering an inch away from his head. The director kept asking why on earth he had done that. Now President Yu vented that he was just testing the protagonist to see if he was worthy of being assigned that job, and that he wouldn't actually hit him. He continued to argue desperately that he would never hit the president's grandson and begged him to believe him. At that moment, he promised that he would hand over all the bank books. Dying of fear, suddenly, a loud crash of metal objects falling to the ground was heard, and there were two of the director's men carrying a metal canister. Still serious, the intimidating Hat asked who sent you to do that. Terrified, the scoundrel said he didn't know what he was talking about and merely stated that he was testing the hero. Without saying anything, the suited director signaled for his servants to do what needed to be done. The two placed a table over the president, who was tied up, and began to untie his hands. But he still didn't understand anything that was happening, becoming even more desperate. One of the servants forced him to place his hand on the table. The other was also trying to do the same, but the president was still reluctant to comply. The director, maintaining his posture, said it was better that the answers given to him now were more satisfactory, and once again asked who sent him. Still terrified, the long-haired man said that no one sent him to do anything and that there was no one like that. And with a blink of an eye, the director made a sudden move toward the table. He struck the hammer on one of the joints of the president's finger, who screamed in pain with his finger bleeding. Once again, the director questioned who had sent him, and he continued with the same answer, struggling to speak due to the pain. And without wasting time, the director struck another one of his fingers, making him beg for help from so much pain. Again, the same question was asked about who had asked him to do that. Still conscious, the long-haired president said that the director was a lunatic, and that there was no one. And these answers did not please the director, who struck him once more. After that, repeatedly, he hit his fingers over and over again. After some time in this suffering, the table was already soaked in blood. The director asked for the last time President Yu Jigang. A piece of advice was given by the director to him to keep the fingers of his right hand intact. He asked again who had given him the orders, but the president remained silent, with no answer at all, just looking down. Without mercy, the suited director asked for him to be held. But with that threat, the long-haired scoundrel decided to spill the beans, saying he would tell everything if they stopped. He revealed that he was ordered by Chien Suman. President Chien Suman had ordered him to do all that. A week earlier, in a large, luxurious house, the 4 presidents were gathered in a business room, and a very important person was arriving at that location, with many men bowing to him. Upon arriving there, he greeted everyone, saying it had been a long time. The 4 presidents greeted Chien Suman, bowing to him. Now everyone was gathered in the room for the conversation to begin. The fearful president asked why they were called there and wanted to know the reason the 4 were there together. Thus, Chien Suman mentioned that everyone had heard about the new boy at his father's house. The fighter asked if he meant the president's grandson, the son of the late Mrs. Misuk. Chien began to spill the beans, saying that he was learning to work with his grandfather and the director these days. One of the presidents reported that the young man appeared suddenly and said he would learn the old man's work by sticking to him, but they were afraid that this would spread strange rumors. Suman said that they were all like family members, and the foundations of Mindong continued the president's work, but there were rumors of another heir. A moment of silence fell over the room, with all the presidents already knowing what was to come. Suman said he didn't know how long his father would live, and that they should pay attention to this now to prevent any street bastard from entering and interfering with the president's judgment. The fighter president told Suman to be careful with his words, as the great loan shark was still healthy. The great scoundrel with the cracked mouth said he had said something wrong in front of the chubby one, and that his servants were indeed loyal servants. But nonetheless, he said that for the president's sake, they should get rid of someone who would be messing up his judgment. And once again, as silence settled in the room, given Suman's words, one of them says that being the president's grandson, it was a family matter, so they had no justification to interfere. But Suman counters by saying it wasn't a family fight, and asks if he thought he was afraid of that young man, but reveals he was only concerned about his father's decision. The man with the split lips said they didn't know how politics would change with the new president, so that decision could have a huge influence on business. They all stare at each other in silence for a moment, and now Suman revealed that soon Director Hay would visit them all with the young master. And now the big fool said they weren't making a difficult request, but only wanted them to test to see what kind of guy he was. Again, they all returned to silence, reflecting on what should be done. However, the first to agree by banging his glass on the table was President Yu. He was determined to test him once to see if he was useful or not. He claimed that the hero was just a 20-year-old kid who knew nothing about their work, and now he was determined to teach the protagonist a lesson. Suman was already filled with joy, saying that as always, President Yu was the quickest to understand. He added that all the presidents should think carefully, as his father's time would not last forever. They all watched curious and astonished by everything that had been said. Now at last, Suman left his dear nephew in their hands. Now the president was already aware that Suman was behind everything. The director reported that they tried to test the young master, and among them, President Jigang stepped forward saying he would do it. Now the president asked what had happened to Jigang, and the man in black said he was taken to the hospital for surgery and that he could no longer use his left hand. However, the president said that man had worked hard by his side for 30 years and ordered to let him live so he could retire. Now the director asked what the gentleman would do with the 2 presidents' chin, if that warning would be enough. Grumpy, the old man said he would take care of him alone. Now the malicious president was outraged by what happened to Jigang. The fearful president reported that he had his hands crushed by a hammer, and now they feared that their father had discovered everything. Suddenly, the phone next to them began to ring. The evil president answered furiously, apologizing, and on the phone, they said the decision was up to the higher president. The old man already knew that Suman was with him, and the slicked back hair confirmed it. The big loan shark asked if he had asked the Mindong bosses to test Megyek, and Suhan stumbled over his words, saying he only ordered them to take care of him. However, the president, upon hearing this, remained silent. Furious, the old man said he should have matured at least a little at that age. The white-haired man questioned whether he had done all that because he felt threatened by a boy who had just turned 20. And now he said that, with Suhan's actions, he questioned whether he should really make Megyek his heir. Still frustrated, the slicked back hair tried to apologize, but the president didn't want to hear any of it. The big loan shark said he didn't even want to hear a word about him messing with his grandson once again, and if that happened, he would throw him out of his family without a cent. Upon hearing this, the president shrank back, wondering if his father would really do that. The other person beside him was curious to know what his father said. But the call ended, and Suhen threw the phone with all his might against the wall. He was furious with the protagonist for getting in between him and his father. Now, at the old man's house, there was an outbreak. It was reported that the elected president Kim Man-san was reorganizing the Hao Council. The director reported that he would reorganize the army as soon as he took office and was firing all the council members. Continuing, the man in black said this was the reaction of the members not meeting more frequently these days. The old man said that perhaps the president was planning to get rid of the council even before taking office, thus he was determined to do so. After all, he had faced many losses during the military regime, having possibly joined hands to overthrow the regime, but they wouldn't get far in the future. The old man wondered if the military would simply let that happen, as that country was theirs. However, the director said some were worried about the possibility of a coup. At that moment, the big loan shark reflected on whether there could be a coup and questioned what Muyuk thought about it. The one quietly reading a newspaper on the other side of the couch argued that the military would not resist at all. Continuing, he said that the president had already replaced the cabinet and the security commander, who were the core of the military, taking only 4 hours of reorganization. Thus, even if he dealt with the ruling forces, they were considered a conservative regime. And besides the council, there were no other military officers who would conform. The protagonist stated that the most important thing was that the people would not tolerate the military promoting a coup d'etat, forming a regime. Upon hearing this, the old man expressed great happiness that Muyuk was also interested in politics. Thus, the hero stated that this was the greatest variable in his work, since he made sure to stay updated on all the small pieces of news, even though he knew what would happen in the next 30 years. Now the president asked if there was any other issue besides the council, and what other plans the elected president was promoting. The director reported that, apparently, nobody knew what he was thinking, and not even the secretaries they had planned it themselves knew what the VIP was planning. Continuing, the man in black reported that they said that, at that main conference, the topic would be the war against corruption. Thus, they would recommend disclosing the assets of high-ranking officials, facing great opposition considering the president's personality. The great loan shark said he already expected that, but still, it was a very sudden and major change, and he questioned the real-name financial system. The bearded director reported that this was not mentioned at all, and that economic matters and large corporations had failed to obtain any information. That said, the old man asked the director's opinion. Mr. He reported that the expected reaction was that the side effects of a real-name financial system would occur, at best, within a year, being possible to implement at the end of the president's term. Thus, from the extinction of the last council to the disclosure of the high-ranking officials' assets, the president would have already taken remedial action, and implementing this financial system would only place a burden on him. Faced with this, the president asked the protagonist's opinion. With firmness, he stated that the real-name financial system would be implemented still that year at any cost. Thus, uneasy, the president asked what his justification was. Since the 1970s, this had been discussed, but political protests always failed. With the president's personality, he planned to finalize the preparations and announce it by surprise. At that moment, the president burst out laughing, saying that the protagonist was smart, but he didn't know how politicians thought, since their fate was to never escape the ties of political funds. Thus, at the moment he implemented this system, all his funds would be revealed and he would have no way of dealing with it, never being able to get rid of the evidence quickly. Mugiak agreed with that, but believed they needed to prepare for the funds under third-party names and anonymous accounts. Now the president was aware that the hero really cared about the real name system and reported not to worry, since he divided and kept them with people he could trust. Now with seriousness, Mugiak told his grandfather that there was no end to human greed. He explained that, with the seal and the checkbooks, borrowed names would not be a problem, but when the system was implemented, the president would not be able to access the money, generating a major problem. The truth was that, because of the real name financial system, the grandfather lost almost a quarter of his wealth in borrowed and anonymous accounts. The protagonist knew that the real name system would be implemented in August, and that, without caution, the president could lose enormous amounts of money. The old president remained thoughtful about everything that had been said. Now, with a serious expression, the great loan shark asked if the protagonist really thought this system would be implemented that very year and questioned if that was just a guess. Mugiak affirmed, saying that it was what his intuition told him, that it could be delayed until the beginning of the president's term, but no later than that summer. Suddenly, now the president asked if the hero had also discovered about the bank books handed to the chiefs of Mindong through his intuition. However, he reported that he had never told anyone about those books and asked how the protagonist had found out about them. But what he didn't expect was that the protagonist was waiting for him to ask that question. Thus, he said that, upon taking over the bank books, judging by the expressions on those faces, everyone felt it was strange. Continuing, he said that, in a private space, when he asked them directly, It seemed like they were hiding something, and they themselves told him. With that, the big idiot asked if all of this was just his intuition, and Muyuk confirmed that it was. At that moment, the old man called for Muyuk to tell him something serious. The president entrusted the protagonist with 400 billion from the secret accounts and asked him to protect and use the money as he saw fit. The old man said that if the protagonist wasted that money, it would be the last he would receive, then asked if he understood well. Lowering his head, the hero assured that he would not make any mistakes. Convinced, the protagonist reflected that he had expected all of this, but was surprised because he did not expect Xian Taizhen to trust him with everything, having 400 billion mined on. At that moment, he realized that he could boost his plan to fight against the Qian brothers in the future, thus exclaiming that all the trust from his grandfather was worth it. Some time passed in the mansion, and Muyuk was no longer present there. The old man told the director to unify all the accounts with borrowed and false names and to ensure they were ready by July. Thus, the underground black director said he would do as the president commanded. Now the white-haired man reflected on Muyuk's words with the real name system being implemented by August, and if it really happened, Muyuk would reveal himself as a child born with the intuition of celestial fortune. In February 1993, the president's inauguration ceremony took place, being a civilian instead of a military leader, marking the launch of the so-called civil government. Upon taking office, the president initiated reforms such as dissolving the council and disclosing the assets of public officials, also preparing for the launch of the real name system. Now inside the university and the admission ceremony of Korea University, Muyuk was on stage receiving an award from one of the important figures of the university. Everyone applauded that moment for our protagonist. After all this commotion, he was already outside with his friend Myung-soo, who found all of it unbearably boring. He questioned what our hero would do at that moment, since classes would start the next day. Thus, Muyuk replied that he would check out the library, which made his friend strange, calling him weird for studying on the first day. On the other hand, the protagonist said that since they were in college, they should at least know the library. But still, Myung-soo looked at the protagonist with disdain. Surprised, Myung-soo said that the hero's accent was already very natural, considering he hadn't come to Seoul before his friend, and asked him if he was trying to charm some girl. His colleague's plan was to visit one of the wealthiest districts in the area to drink and celebrate their admission, but the protagonist was not in the mood to drink at all. Myung-soo admitted to having made a mistake the last time they drank and promised not to repeat it. Then the protagonist asked if he only thought about having fun instead of preparing for the exam. Confident, the short guy said he would pass the first phase of the exam and just wanted to have fun that day. With that, he kept begging Muyuk to go drink that day. Now finally convinced, the protagonist said they would just have a few drinks and come back. That night, they were already at a very lively club with loud music playing. Myung-soo tried to get close to the girls dancing, saying that was the smell of youth, but they felt very uncomfortable near him. He told Muyuk that this place was a rock cafe and that there were no such places in Busan, as they didn't reserve tables there, just fun. The protagonist was not in the mood for much conversation, just drinking in his corner, until suddenly, a girl came up to him who recognized him. They commented that they knew he was the best student at Korea University and said they thought he was a model student who only studied, but saw that he also frequented places like that. They continued saying that they were his seniors at the university, being in their second year, and heard that he got a perfect score on the ceremony exam. Now flirting with the protagonist, one of them said he was more handsome up close and that she couldn't believe the best student in the country had a face like that, thus asking to join him. A bit disheartened, the hero said he didn't mind if they joined him, but beforehand mentioned that he planned to leave after that drink he was having. Suddenly, Myung-soo interrupted, saying it was all good and that they should have a lot of fun that night. The music kept playing, and the atmosphere was perfectly pleasant in that environment. They all gathered at the same table and began exchanging ideas. The interested girls asked if they were friends before, and Myung-soo replied that they had been since childhood. One of the girls notices that Myung-soo was not from Seoul, and he says he is from Busan. He asks if they have ever been there and comments on Gangali Beach. The noble maiden realizes he was referring to Gangali Beach and thinks Myung-soo's accent is cute. The girl next to the protagonist wonders why he is so quiet, but asserts that it makes sense. Being handsome, he should be stoic, as just looking at him makes her feel good. Suddenly, a man in a suit calls out to the protagonist, surprised to find him there. Muyuk recognizes that voice, saying it sounds very familiar. Thus, he comes face to face with one of the club's presidents. This was Juwon, whom the girl at the table already knew and asked if this guy knew about Muyuk. The hero wondered where that guy had come from and decided it was better to avoid him. The protagonist decides to say he is leaving and calls Myung-soo to come along, but he disagrees, saying he would like to have a few more drinks. Muyuk, being stoic, tells him to just have one more beer and go home, and exclaims to Ju-won not to mind them and to enjoy himself. Before that, he tells him not to overdo it and not to cause problems again. The maiden interested in the protagonist complains, asking him where he is going. But as she tries to run after the protagonist, she is stopped by Ju-won, who questions why she is walking with guys like Muyuk of such low class. But the young lady does not like his attitude at all, saying it does not matter who she is with, especially to him. Muyuk was already keeping an eye on that situation and reflected that whenever he drank, he ended up getting involved in those situations. The maiden kept saying for that man to let her go, but he remained firm. Suddenly, the protagonist decides to act, telling that scoundrel to stop bothering the girl. But he does not like Muyuk's attitude at all, telling him to let go, that he should not dare to touch him. The hero reflects that Ju-won has always caused trouble since he was young, but it was obvious that these acts always bothered his grandfather. Now very close to the scoundrel's ear, he says he does not want to show that he knows him because it is shameful. With that, he states that there are many people there and that he should stop causing problems, as his grandfather would have to deal with everything he does. The protagonist's words really affected Ju-won, who became anxious. Now determined, Ju-won wanted to finish off Muyuk that day and calls his crew. 3 thugs arrived at the scene, saying they were having fun and received his call. Muyuk had already thought that that scoundrel had someone to count on. The scoundrel says that a cockroach crawled into his house and orders them to step on the protagonist, telling them not to worry, as it was not their first time. Prepared for a fight, the protagonist tells Myung-soo to take the veterans away. Frightened, his friend asks if things will be okay, but soon Muyuk asks if he forgot who he was. But to Muyuk's surprise, he was referring to the enemies, questioning if they would be okay. And before he could finish his sentence, Muyuk was already being attacked, but luckily he manages to dodge, and he quickly retaliates at the same moment with a punch, knocking down his opponent. And now he felt the same joy from his youth when fighting bullies. Some time passes, and the music continues playing at the party, and there was no one left, with a mess everywhere. And now Ju-won could not hide his fearful expression. After all his henchmen were defeated and thrown to the ground unconscious, suddenly Muyuk was in front of him to finish what he started. The protagonist tells him to stop hanging out with those guys and acting like a thug, as his grandfather already knew everything. The hero could not believe that someone like Ju-won was the eldest son of that family. In light of this, Muyuk says that if it happens again, it does not matter if he is his cousin, he will not let it slide. Ju-won lowers his head and says he understands perfectly. Now leaving the place, the protagonist tells him to take care of the rest and make sure no one is bothered by that mess. And if it happens again, they will have to meet again. And once again, the big scoundrel could not hide his expression of fear and despair. It was a sunny day with a clear sky while classes were taking place at Hagi University. A professor was teaching his subject, asking the students if any of them knew what Article 1 of the country's constitution stated. Soon a boy raised his hand, saying that the Republic of Korea was a democratic republic. The professor quickly confirmed that the answer was correct and asked about Article 1, Section 2. However, none of the students knew how to answer that question. In light of this, the old man explained that the sovereignty of the Republic of Korea resided in the people, thus all state authority emanates from the people. The professor said that anyone who became a prosecutor, lawyer, or judge after graduating there should always keep Article 1, Sections 1 and 2 in their heart. Muyuk, who was present, reflected on what the professor said about a professional who forgets those 2 pillars not being a legal professional. Upon leaving the classroom, Myeonjin called the protagonist, who asked about the plans with Kyungsung that night, but he replied that Kyungsung was also busy with training. Then suddenly, a voice behind them resonated calling for the protagonist, and there was a beautiful woman asking if that man was indeed Muyuk. Noticing the girl's appearance, Myeong-sun was already astonished, saying that she was very beautiful, and questioned who she was. The young lady introduced herself as Cheon Jisoo, and claimed that Muyuk would know who she was. The hero reflected that, although it was the first time he encountered her in this life, that expression on her face was familiar. He knew that she was the daughter of his uncle Chin Suman and the granddaughter of the president. The protagonist stated that he clearly remembered her eyes when she treated him like an insect in his past life. In light of this, the noble lady asked if he had any free time, as she needed to talk to him. Muyuk fell silent for a moment while reflecting on what he would say. Now inside a car, she apologized for the delay in introducing herself, as it had been a long time since she visited her grandfather. She commented that she heard that the protagonist scored the highest on the entrance exam, graduated as the best in his class, and revealed that she also studied business administration there. However, Muyuk was not in the mood for conversation and quickly asked why she was there, revealing that he had plans to meet a friend. Given this reaction, the president's granddaughter said that the protagonist was a bit cold, as it was their first meeting as cousins. The protagonist argued that his uncles had been giving him a lot of trouble and a strict upbringing, and when she said she was their daughter, he couldn't help but be cautious. The girl was already aware of the situation, knowing that Muyek had dominated all the bosses in Myeongdong. Thus, she demonstrated that she had come to see him after learning about that. Suddenly, that girl was proposing an alliance with Muyek. With her hand extended, the protagonist still did not understand what she meant. The woman continued arguing that there was no need for them to be pitted against each other, as she had no interest in her grandfather's business, and also did not care whether Muyek learned from him or not. Now she revealed that her only interest was in the Samsung group. After this revelation, Muyek began to understand what she was really trying to say. In light of this, the girl explained that if the protagonist helped her, she would help him become his grandfather's successor. She continued saying that before the protagonist's arrival, Chien Ji-won was destined to be the successor. But with Muyek in the picture, many things would change. The beautiful girl reported that lately, it seemed like it would be a fight between the protagonist and his brother. So if the alliance were formed, she would inform him of useful things for him to win. Muyek did not believe that Chien Ji-won could do anything and stated that she was overestimating her brother. However, the girl told him not to underestimate him, as he was the eldest grandson, and no matter how much the protagonist's grandfather liked him, he remained a stranger. In conclusion, the noble maiden said that if Ji-won received support from the Samsung group, anything could happen, so the protagonist should be careful. In light of this, the hero asked what that girl wanted from him in return, as in an alliance there are always gifts and takeaways. In this sense, the brown-haired girl revealed that if the protagonist inherited his grandfather's position, he should support her with the Samsung shares he would possess. But the protagonist did not understand, as for him, Ji-won becoming the successor would support the girl in any case, since she was his blood relative. But upon hearing this, the woman began to laugh ironically. She argued that if that guy took over the business, he would probably try to swallow the entire Samsung, as he was very ambitious. Still suspicious, Muyek asked if she could take over the Samsung group with his support, as that same group already had a clear succession plan. However, the maiden said that she did not aim to take over the entire Samsung group, as she was not reckless, and revealed that she wanted to take at least half, as that was her mother's right, being the eldest daughter of Samsung. The hero reflected that in his previous life, Jisoo entered the succession war after the president passed away, and after a fierce battle, she managed to secure a third of Samsung, but by that time, the group was already irreparably damaged. Thus, that woman he knew should not be underestimated, as she would stab him in the back at any moment for her goals. With that, the protagonist concludes that it was strange for her to be proposing an agreement to him at that moment. Continuing his reasoning, Muyek exclaims that she would only lose with that agreement, but she does not understand what he is saying. He explains that it seemed like she was on the side of the loser, receiving only a promise from the protagonist, because if he did not become his grandfather's successor, she would gain nothing, and even if she took over, she would be in trouble if he betrayed her. Jisoo reflects and concludes that he was right, saying that she was at a disadvantage, but she could not bear the idea of her brother taking all the assets. She then adds that that scoundrel had gotten everything since he was young, and she would like to see someone else taking what he was earning. The protagonist is pleased with these words and says he will think about the matter. Anxious, the woman pleads for an answer as soon as possible, and so she reveals that if the protagonist says no, she would have to find another way to achieve her goals. With that, Muyek gets out of the car and the girl leaves the place. Suddenly, Mangsu was back looking for the protagonist. He questioned who that slender girl was and was indignant, as only the hero could get beautiful women. Muyek explains that she was just his cousin, whom he met for the first time. Upon hearing this, his friend could not hide the smile on his face. Now he clung to the idea that Muyek would be his brother-in-law, wanting to get closer to the woman. In light of this, the protagonist continued to ponder his cousin's actions. He recalled that in his past life, she did not even treat him like a human being, but now she was proposing an alliance. Being extremely favorable to him, he now saw this as an opportunity, or perhaps a very dangerous trap. Now back at the mansion of the great Chief Chien, the old man asked if Muyek had fun in his first class. The protagonist argued that his cousin came to meet him. The old man exclaimed that the hero had no siblings, so he should at least get along with his cousins. To reassure him, the protagonist said he decided to keep in touch with her frequently, but all of this was part of the plan to get the Samsung assets. At that moment, the boss asked why the protagonist had requested to see him as soon as he got home. In response, Muyek said it was about the 400 billion won in the secret account that had been entrusted to him and revealed that he wanted to move everything abroad. He argued that there was no immediate need for that, so he decided to invest abroad. The old man presumed he was confident but asked if he remembered what was said to him when the account was handed over. Muyek clearly recalled that the money was the last he received from his grandfather. In this sense, the old man said it was not a bad idea to keep it in the country to maintain the current situation and asked why he insisted on transferring it abroad. Quickly becoming alert, the hero knew it was not easy to move money out of the country, especially with the new system being implemented, but with his grandfather's influence, it was possible. Thus, the protagonist argued that, in his opinion, the current administration was starting to create unfavorable policies for his grandfather, and even if he was not the direct target, he believed that the underground economy he had would suffer more. Therefore, he thought it necessary to transfer the money. Cleverly, Muyek said it would be easy to send the 400 billion abroad using the subsidiaries of the conglomerates that had been borrowed. In the old man's view, it was not difficult to transfer the money, but he saw no valid reason for it. He questioned whether it was a bit hasty to move the money just because of policies that had not been implemented. Persistently, the hero said that since the money had been entrusted to him, he earnestly requested his grandfather's support. In the protagonist's mind, that seemed bold, but taking a direct approach might be better. After all, he could not use all his knowledge to persuade him. But suddenly, the boss began to laugh loudly. He compared Muyek to his uncles who could not even speak without stuttering in front of him. Thus, he did not know if the protagonist was not afraid or if he was just full of spirit. With that, he revealed that, thanks to the protagonist, he had been laughing a lot in recent days, and now he agreed to transfer only the funds. Again, the hero asked him to transfer the entire amount of 400 billion and pleaded that, for the next 7 years, he not be questioned about the money. The old man was surprised by the protagonist's audacity in using these methods to manage his money. But with confidence, Muyek assured him that there was no chance they would lose the 400 billion. In light of this, the big boss told him to do as he wished and would ask the director to discreetly transfer everything to the United States. However, once again, he warned him that if he lost the money, there would be no second chance. Still confident in his actions, the protagonist said he understood all of this. In his mind, he needed the funds to face his uncles in the future. Thus, with the money out of the country, they would not interfere at all. However, he knew that managing all this money alone would be a hassle, so he needed someone in charge on his behalf. With that in mind, he remembered Super Formiga, a hunting dog for foreign investment companies. In the late 90s, this man shook the Korean stock market, and during that time, was an individual investor who faced numerous failures and accidents. He was the one who raked in hundreds of billions in just 10 years, Han Kyung-dun. Time passed quickly once again, and now the protagonist found himself at the Moonsun Motel. Director Ha had informed him that this person had many loan debts, so it wasn't difficult to find him. But first, Ha had asked why the protagonist wanted to find a man like that. Muyek had already entered the motel looking for the reception. When he arrived there, he told the attendant that he was looking for someone named Mr. Han Kyung-yeon. Startled, the lady asked if he was from the police and said that no one filled out the records in a lodging like that, so she didn't know anyone's name. Thus, the hero asked if there was a man in his 20s who had been there for a long time. In response, the woman tried to remember if there was any young guy staying at the lodging. But suddenly, Muyek offered a good sum of money for the lady to refresh her memory. Suddenly, she remembered everything, but she didn't know his name. She confirmed that there was a young man staying there and said she would check. But to everyone's surprise, the man they were talking about appeared, yawning. The lady quickly pointed to him, saying that it was indeed that guy. At that moment, the young man got scared and dashed for the stairs. Muyek ran after him, calling his name. He asked him to wait as he just wanted to talk. The long chase led them to the rooftop of the building. There, the guy was trying to jump off in an act of desperation. The protagonist begged him not to do that, as he was not there to collect money. The man began to listen to him, but he was still very much in shock and distressed. Once again, the protagonist asked them to just talk. Frightened, the great genius asked if he wasn't a loan shark. However, this question led Muyek to question himself, as he was also a loan shark. Now the protagonist and the great genius found themselves at the Maekyung Real Estate Agency. In front of a door, the hero asked if this was the right place. Frightened, Han asked if he was sure he wanted to go in, as the people there were very scary. The protagonist, brave, said they were there to pay the money to those people, so they shouldn't be afraid. They quickly entered the room and saw two men having a meal. These same guys were startled to see who was there facing them. They were not pleased at all with Han Kyung-yeon's presence. The chubby guy approached Kyung-yeon, asking if he had come there to die. But as soon as this scoundrel tried to lay hands on Four Eyes, the protagonist interrupted by grabbing his arm. Without wasting time, the hero immobilized that man, twisting his arm behind his back. Furious, the man asked who he was and told him to let go of his hands. The protagonist, still confident, said they were there to pay his money, so he should stop making a fuss and call his boss. That same boss arrived at the door asking what all the noise was about, but as soon as he saw, Kyung-yeon was startled. He said that Four Eyes didn't know how much they missed him and had looked for him, questioning about his money. Soon, Muyek interrupted, saying he would pay that young man's debt and asked how much it was in total. The AG explained that 6 months ago he borrowed 500 with 30% interest upfront and with a monthly rate of 22% and a late fee of 12%. But while he was talking, the protagonist was already losing patience and told him to stop fiddling with that book, and just say how much he was squeezing in total. Upon hearing these words, the scoundrel said that the young man was quite experienced, as he was quick to understand. Now it was revealed that he owed the meager sum of 50 million and claimed he wanted to resolve it cleanly for that amount. Quattro Ojos freaked out at that figure, as he had been told just days ago that he owed 25 million, and questioned how he could ask for 10 times more in a year. Meanwhile, the scoundrel already had the answer on the tip of his tongue, saying it was all in the contract and that the client was shameless for not having read it. He explained that there were late fees and also the 17 million they spent tracking him down, and there were also 8 million for emotional damages. Adding it all up would total 50 million. Muyuk already knew that in that world, the magic of turning 5 million into 50 was very possible, while the young man trembled with rage at the fraud. The protagonist reflected that the essence of loan sharking was to squeeze desperate people down to the bone. Seeing the debtor's attitude, the unscrupulous loan shark said he shouldn't be so audacious and arrogant, as he had been fleeing from his debt and should have his flesh torn from his bones and pickled. While Quattro Ojos was trembling with fear, Muyek summarized that 50 million would solve everything, and the loan shark confirmed that if he brought that money, he would tear up the documentation in front of him. Now the protagonist asked to use the phone, and it was granted to him. He quickly called Director Ha and asked him to prepare 50 million won and bring it to the address where he was. Done and done. Now Muyuk reported that in 15 minutes the money would be there, and the loan shark was surprised at how uncomplicated that boy was. But at that moment, the scoundrel asked why he was paying such a large debt to that man and questioned if he had any relationship with him. In that sense, the protagonist explained that they had met for the first time that day, but he had business with that man and was therefore paying on his behalf. Once again, the loan shark was impressed with this young man and said he would like to work with him, thus offering him a position in his office. Muyek declined, saying he was a student. However, the loan shark insisted that after he graduated, he should call him, as he would offer him a great payment. In light of this, the protagonist reflected that he didn't remember that loan shark, so he would probably disappear completely after the new real name system. In summary, he replied that he wasn't interested in that position and asked how much he could earn in that shoehole, which surprised the loan shark. The subordinates of that scoundrel were irritated by the hero's words. Continuing, he said that even if he dealt with loans, he should know the limits and threaten the debtors with the thugs he had hired. The loan shark simply replied that he really enjoyed doing that and asked if Muyek hadn't learned good manners, as he was speaking in an extremely aggressive tone. In response, Muyek said that an unethical loan shark talking about education and good manners at home was a big joke. This generated great outrage in the loan shark, who said to grab the protagonist so he could teach him a little respect. Quattro Ojos, who was watching everything, was more afraid than Muyek, and the latter, who didn't even care about what was happening, was checking his watch, knowing it was already time. Suddenly, the door of that place opened, and the hero already knew who was entering. He said it was the perfect moment. Arriving at the location, Director had asked if something was wrong. The two idiots who worked for the loan shark tried to intimidate the director by asking who he was. Getting closer, the chubby one asked how he dared to invade the place and questioned if he wanted to die. The fat one continued to harass him, asking if he was with those two thugs, saying he would get beaten up along with them. The loan shark boss knew the director's identity and kept shouting for them to stop all that show. In an instant, the boss was facing Ha, head down, bowing to him. However, the shaved head man asked if he knew him, and the fool said that everyone who worked in the Mindong business would know him and knew he worked for President Chian Taizan. Now, with his tail between his legs, the loan shark asked what brought him to such a humble place. But without saying anything to him, the director simply handed the 50 million to the young master. Upon hearing the words that came out of the director's mouth, saying that Muyuk was the young master, he completely panicked. The little loan shark was deeply terrified and now realized that the young man was the grandson of President Chian Taizan, the son of his daughter. The director asked what was happening, and the hero explained that nothing special was occurring. He was just paying the debt of someone he knew. And now, toying with the loan shark, he said that the boss there was looking for family education, not money. He collapsed to the ground on his knees, begging for forgiveness from Muyuk. He exclaimed that he had made a great mistake by not recognizing the young master and pleaded for his life. His men did not understand what was happening, so he quickly ordered them to kneel, for that was the grandson of President Chian. Now at that moment, the three fools were kneeling, saying they were very sorry and begging for forgiveness. Master Han, who was observing everything, could not believe what was happening before his eyes. At that moment, without saying a word, Muyek simply placed the briefcase of money on the chief's desk. Now with confidence and mockery, he said that he could take his money. Now the protagonist ordered the loan shark to check if the money was all there. As he rummaged through it, he realized there was about 50 million, and in response, Muyek ordered him to return the contract. Quickly, still frightened, the charlatan handed over the envelope. The protagonist, without complaining about anything, simply looked at the four eyes and handed the envelope to him, telling him to check it. Han's trembling hands were noticeable as he was still out of sorts. He looked at the envelope in shock without saying a word, but suddenly he became electric and started tearing up the paperwork in front of everyone, leaving nothing of that deed, which was now worthless. Everyone looked on in disbelief at the entire situation that had unfolded. Muyek asked if his debt was now settled, and the loan shark said yes, it was all paid. Now the hero proposed that they do some calculations, but the scoundrel did not understand what he was saying. The prota argued that for the mental shock he suffered from the threats and aggressive language, he would deduct 10 million, thus taking the money from the briefcase. The loan shark, who had been scared until then, now did not understand the hero's attitude. The prota continued saying he would take another 15 million for the trouble he had to go through to find Han and another 10 for disrupting the director with his fees. It was now evident that the loan shark was losing control of the situation and asked what that young man was doing. But Muyek remained firm and said he was just settling debts the way he did. And finally he said he would take a compensation of 15 million for wasting his time, bringing the total to 50 million won. And now that it was finished, he asked if he could take that bag with him. The charlatan said that the prota was going too far and asked how he could do that to him. However, the protagonist remained confident in his actions and said he was just following his way of doing things and affirmed that he was not wrong. In light of these arguments, the loan shark had nothing more to say, so he just stammered, not knowing what to say. With the confidence that director He had in Muyek, he did not interfere at all, just watching. In response, the hero said that everything was resolved and he was leaving. And finally he had something to mention to the director. He said to make sure those men never entered Myeongdong again. And so the director understood the order and said he would comply. Now with the prota and the four eyes out of the room, the director was about to act against the scoundrels. Calmly he just sat in the nearest chair and asked who they worked for. Then the half-hearted loan shark said he worked for President Seok Kang-ho. On a nearby street, the protagonist and Han found themselves at a food stall. The Four Eyes was downing a shot of vodka. His happiness was evident after lifting that weight off his shoulders. The protagonist asked if now that his debt was resolved, Mr. Han felt better. But he was answered with another question, which was about who the hero was. The Four Eyes argued that the prota was young and could make 50 million appear out of nowhere, and even those gangsters were trembling in front of him. But calmly, Muyek said he was just a student and showed his ID. But Mr. Han could not comprehend and asked him to stop joking and tell him the whole truth. In response, the great genius asked if that director from earlier and his grandfather, Chien Tae-san, were some kind of loan masters. But Muyek said that did not matter and was there because he needed him to do something for him. Still downcast, the Four Eyes said that Muyek already had everything he did not have and asked what he wanted from a broke stockbroker like him. Being very direct, Muyek said he wanted him to do what he did best and trade stocks for him. The little genius had no confidence in himself and said he lost all his money by accumulating debts, and now the protagonist wanted him to do it again. However, the hero asked if he had ever thought about something. That something was, if he could have a lot of money and much more funds, he would feel powerful enough to crush any market scheme. In response, Mr. Han said he was certain of this because, if he had money, the market would be very easily manipulated by him. But he had never had any money at all. Suddenly, Muyek handed him an envelope, telling him to open it. He revealed that Four Eyes should use that to heat up the stock market the next day, and it didn't matter if he lost everything. Anxiously, Mr. Han opened the envelope, and it was revealed to be a check for 100 million won. The hero said he should consider that a contractual deposit to start the business, so he needed to show his skills now that he had funds. However, the protagonist had a condition. He said he would choose a specific stock item, and Four Eyes should do whatever he commanded, no matter what. Still confused, the little genius asked why he was doing this if he didn't even know him. And now he questioned what he would do if he ran away to a foreign country with all that money. But Muyek, unafraid, said he didn't care if he did that. He added that he knew he would invest in stocks even if he fled to another country. Now Kyung-san knew he had been caught in the act and felt embarrassed. Muyek added that, just as he didn't need to know his identity, he also didn't care who Four Eyes was. The hero sincerely said he was just giving him a chance with that money, so he needed to show his skills. Mr. Han was surprised by such kindness and remained speechless. The protagonist had read in his biography that if Korea had given him a chance, and if the Korean stock market had been a place of common sense where rules applied, he would never have come to South Korea as a hunting dog. Now the protagonist was willing to give that chance that Kyung-san needed to prove his worth. However, at that moment, he should become his own hunting dog and hunt for him. And if Kyung-yang moved according to his plan, he would have enough capital to fight against his brothers. However, one more piece was missing for his kingdom to be established. That would be a physical force willing to fight for him. And now he wondered how Park Dong-soo, the great delinquent, was faring in Busan. On an ordinary night, the protagonist's mafia enemies were gathered in a nightclub. One of them was not satisfied with what one of the members was saying, that it was to deal with Dongsu and divide the territory among them. The big guy said that Dongsu could have dominated all of Busan, but he lacked good subordinates and all the bosses had been caught, so he had no one he could trust. Byun knew they wouldn't fight for Park, and all they had to do was attack quickly and eliminate Dongsu, then everything would be over. The other bald member asked if he really had orders for that, and he added, arguing that they needed a justification for others to trust them, or it would all turn into a total war, and they would be completely screwed. But the big guy was sure they shouldn't worry because he himself had received orders to keep an eye on Dongsu. Now he was determined to take Busan and take Park out of the game. Now in the Busan prison, there was the great Park Dongsu, who was talking to an inmate, saying he would manage everything very well until he was released. But the prisoner said that when he got out, he would retire because he was too old, and told Dongsu to manage it as if it were his own. However, the guard said that the time for conversation was over. The inmate was leaving and said it was good to see Park after a long time, advising him to work hard and not to visit him frequently. And finally, with a sad look, he told Dongsu to take care. The rogue managed to sense what that inmate was trying to convey to him and just remained silent. And so they said goodbye with great respect from both sides. Now inside a luxurious car with very well protected escort, Dongsu's lawyer asked him if the visit had gone well. He argued that the man had aged a lot over the years, and so he didn't feel good about it. The young man next to him said that Dongsu and the other guy seemed to be very close to each other. But for Park, who was raised by his grandfather after his mother and father abandoned him, and when his grandfather suddenly passed away, he couldn't even attend the funeral. In light of this, it seems that his grandfather briefly worked in that area with Hunnim when he was young, and when he received the news, he came running, crying. The little thug reveals that he said he would drop out of school and work for that man, but he received 3 million from him to finish school first. So as soon as he graduated, that man gave him 10 million to think for another month. Thus, exactly 1 month later, Dongsu returned with all 10 million and said that working for him made more sense than all that money. But upon hearing this, Hyong Nim just thought that the kid was completely crazy and accepted him as his employee. In this way, Dongsu said that the man expected him to spend all the money and run away. However, he reflected that, at that moment, he seemed to be the only one there, and it didn't seem right, as he should have told that individual 3 years ago, so they could have avoided his imprisonment. The young boy next to him asks if he was referring to that time he was saved thanks to a student who told him everything that would happen. Soon, Park gets excited, talking about Mihyuk and how that kid was no joke, eagerly anticipating their reunion upon learning he was coming to Busan. Dongsu had headed towards the Saesong trade and finally reunited with Mihyuk. They greet each other, and Dongsu notices that the protagonist has grown a lot and comments that all that milk he drank really helped him grow. The formalities continued with the protagonist asking if he was doing well, and the little thug asking if he was doing well in college. At that moment, Dongsu introduced his lawyer to the prota, as it was the first time he met him. Back to business, Park said that transforming the organization into a corporation was not a problem, so he hired a lawyer, as he was told. Straightforward and blunt, the prota asks how much of Busan he had already dominated and how much he thought was left to finish. In response, the gangster said that as soon as they dominated the Haeundae area, they would be almost done, and after that, they would need reliable guys to manage. In this sense, Dongsu asked why the kid was in such a hurry, since he was told it wouldn't take more than 6 months. The hero revealed that, with the war in Seoul against crime, large areas were in a power vacuum, but the organizations were regaining control. The conversation was interrupted when the door burst open, and the man said they were under attack. It was reported that Seomyeon, Yeonsandong, Bosudong, and Hayden had joined forces. Terrified, Dongsu ran to the entrance to look at the movement, and they came face to face with the mobsters from earlier barging into the place. Those who had already spotted Dongsu were ready to attack him. Part Dongsu was perplexed to realize he was being betrayed by his companions. The gangsters were confident they would come out on top in that situation and asked how Park had been. The little thug couldn't hide his concern, but it was evident that he harbored great hatred towards them. The clash was about to happen with all the mobsters gathered. Quickly, the big guy noticed that Mihyuk was also present in the fight, but he didn't care about that as he thought it would make things more fun and felt very lucky. The protagonist reflected on what was happening at that moment, as he had faith that Park Dongsu had already dominated all of Busan. Park couldn't believe that the big guy Sungo had betrayed him and questioned who had ordered him to do that. Bin replied that he didn't obey anyone's orders and that Dongsu himself had caused that, and this applied to all those present who could no longer endure Park's tyranny. Some of them, like the mustached man, lamented their actions but still asked for understanding. The hero reflected that Dongsu had exaggerated in the kindness he showed to his subordinates, while he questioned why they were doing this to him. They argued that they couldn't stand seeing him dominating all of Busan and said they should also win in life. The gangster felt very hurt by the betrayal of his servants after showing all the kindness he had. Dong-su's lawyer exclaimed that he had called for reinforcements, and it would take 10 minutes for everyone to arrive. Suddenly, Sungwoo charged at him with a knife, saying he would end this quickly. Moo-yuk remained calm and asked if Park wanted his help. Dong-su saw no sense in that and quickly engaged in combat. He landed a series of punches on one of the thugs holding a knife. The other thug, who tried to surprise him with an attack using his bat, was quickly neutralized with a punch to the ribs, thus falling to the ground in pain, dropping his bat. The guys who were also with Park were acting, punching the enemies. A scoundrel who charged at the lawyer with a pipe is caught by the lawyer's quick eyes. With that, the Four Eyes delivers a blow with a knife to the assailant's wrist, and strikes his leg, gushing a lot of blood. But still, Park and his lawyer were surrounded by the men who betrayed him. Dong-su says that his lawyer was very good with a knife and asks if he spent some time cutting sashimi or something similar. In response, the Four Eyes says he wouldn't have been hired if he were just a lawyer scribbling with a pen. With humor, Park asks if he should pay him for that extra service, and the young man says he wouldn't refuse. The big guy was already furious, telling his subordinates to attack. Dong-su hurriedly says he would talk to his lawyer after everything was over, and thus he charges into battle. At that moment, he landed a precise kick on one of the guys, sending him flying away, and the lawyer continued bloodthirsty, cutting everyone with his knife. The little thug was relentless with his fists, punching his enemies, but suddenly he is surprised from behind, being attacked with a bat. With his face bleeding, Dong-su was about to receive the final blow from one of his former subordinates. However, he rises again and lands a solid punch to his face. Thus, he flies away, dropping the bat, and when he tries to get up, Park was already there to stomp on him without any expression. One of the little thug's friends was worried about him and his head injury, and again, they were surrounded by numerous men. The big guy finally attacks Park directly and stabs him right in the stomach, bringing both of them to the ground. Fortunately, Dong-su managed to hold the knife a bit in his abdomen, but he was still losing a lot of blood. The big guy said not to feel wronged if he killed him, as he had been humiliated in front of all those people. And while he made his speech blaming Park, he received a strong punch to the back of the neck, being thrown away. Moo-yuk was worried about his ally, asking if he was okay. The little thug just said that all of this was humiliating. Not giving up on attacking, the big guy filled with rage, and again raised his knife, heading towards Moo-yuk. However, the protagonist easily dodged, and furious, the big guy tried a series of attacks, saying that the blame was also on the protagonist for everything that had happened. And finally, once again, he tried to stab the hero, but was easily interrupted, thus receiving a well-placed punch to the face. After that, his wrist was twisted by the protagonist, who finished him off with a kick right in the middle of his legs. Now he found himself completely in pain after failing in all his attacks. He said that Moo-hyuk wouldn't be able to be okay after doing all that, and he wouldn't let it go, as he would find him no matter where he went. But Moo-hyuk just grabbed him by the shirt and asked who he was with a serious expression, which made the fat mafioso reflect on his insignificant existence and the protagonist's arrogance. And finally, the prota finished off the scoundrel with a solid punch to his mouth, finally ending up unconscious, thrown on the ground. One of Park's subordinates held him in his arms, asking if he was okay, but it was evident that he was losing a lot of blood. Suddenly, the building was invaded by several of Dong-su's men, who were quickly ordered to beat the invaders. The main group celebrated the arrival of the gang, saying it seemed like everyone had come. Finally, the heroes group emerged victorious, with the mafia bosses kneeling before them. Dong-su asked the scoundrels why they had gone so far. He stated that he had taken control of the area while trusting them to manage it, so they could continue taking care of their families, and yet they had stabbed him in the back. The silence of the scoundrels irritated Park, who told them to open their mouths and say the reason. With a snobbish look, he lamented the mustached man, saying he was very sorry. He questioned the little thug about who was behind all of this and who ordered them to try to take him down. And once again, they fell into total silence. Now Park looked at Bayan and said he would speak first. He continued with his pride high, telling Dong-su to shut up. Determined, Park asked for a knife from one of his subordinates, and now slammed the big guy's head against the ground, holding his arms. Grabbing Bayan's ankle, the little thug said he caused this himself, so he shouldn't blame him. At that moment, the big guy panicked, begging him to wait, but it was too late, and Park finally cut a part of his ankle, causing a lot of blood to flow. All the bosses were oppressed by the whole situation. Incredibly, Bayan continued to be snobbish with his pride, calling Dong-su a bastard. Firmly, the punk kept asking who ordered that. With a mocking smile, the big guy said sarcastically that it was Park's mother who ordered all of that. Still cold, the punk said that he could regret that for the rest of his life when he was in a wheelchair. Suddenly, someone decided to speak up, telling them to wait. He then revealed that everything was ordered by Samsung Hyung, arguing that he was the one who requested all of that when he arrived. Park couldn't believe what he was hearing and wondered why he was trying to cause trouble too. To him, it made no sense for his older brother to do that to him. In complete despair, one of the other scoundrels confirmed, saying that it was Hyung who ordered everything to be done. He added that Sejong had come to them and told them to work under his command. Park was perplexed by what he was hearing, unable to believe the truth. The big guy revealed that Hyung was suspicious of him, as everyone had been caught except him, thus questioning whether he had sold information to the police. Out of control, Park was about to hurt Byung once again, and so he cut his other ankle in the same way he did with the other. Sometime later, everything was calmer, and the protagonist sat with Park in one of the rooms. They were drinking to calm down when the lawyer entered the room silently. He revealed that all the injured people had been sent to the hospital, and the leaders would be monitored separately. Very downcast, Dong-soo asked if he really thought his brother intended to make a move against him. He didn't understand, as he was taking care of everything to avoid resentment, since he was also responsible for his sister-in-law and their families. Incredulous, he questioned why Hyung would do that and what he had done wrong. However, the protagonist was already aware of everything with his future memory, as in his previous life. Sejong also killed Park, incriminating him for his crimes, thus being a person Dong-soo didn't truly know. Thus, the protagonist said that if they left Sejong alone, this kind of thing would happen again. He added that Park's gentle manipulation had been the driving force that allowed the thugs to act. Muyek stated that he needed to bring those who would stay with him and get rid of those who were unnecessary, ensuring they would be unable to return. Dong-soo was indeed very thoughtful about all of that. Thus, the hero suggested that they organize the move first. Park felt offended by the prota's words, saying that he didn't know Sejong well, but considered him like a father. Still cold and irrational, the hero said that no kind of father would order the death of his own son, arguing that Park was no kind of sad prince. Continuing his point, Muyek said that at that time, gangsters didn't care about loyalty and pride, and stated that Dong-soo was the last living in an outdated romanticism. The prota stated that it was evident that Sejong, who considered him like a father, ordered him to stay away, and told him to wake up from that absurd dream. Once again, Dong-soo stood up furious for not being able to bear the protagonist's words. However, he was still too hurt to attempt any sudden movements. Fed up with the situation, the hero stood up and told Park to take care of his brother. Otherwise, he would nullify him from the agreement they made to work together. Mudia quickly left the room while the punk asked him to sit down, questioning what would happen if he continued like that. But coldly, the protagonist asked if he still seemed like the high school student he first met on the hospital roof. He argued that he had given him the opportunity to work together on a plan that involved his destiny, so if he hesitated in the face of any problem, he would have to reconsider that. And still confident, the hero said that if they didn't resolve Busan by October, it would be the end for all of them. With that, he left, slamming the door shut. Park was left behind, saying that he was ashamed of all of that. The lawyer analyzed the prota and said that he was definitely not an ordinary person, as he was only 20 years old and couldn't even imagine what kind of life that boy had led. Dong-soo still felt proud to know Muyek, saying that he wasn't joking when he spoke about him. Park knew that the hero was right, and he knew that relying solely on the forces of a gangster wouldn't sustain him, as without money, everything was just nonsense. He lamented that the world lately was driven only by money, so the four-eyed one questioned how he would resolve things. With his head held high, Dong-soo said they would clean everything up, and finally they would go to Seoul. In a hotel, the room service staff knocked on the door of a room, saying that the checkout for that man had been done 4 hours ago. Thus, the young man orders the maid to open the door. They sneak in to see what was inside. Thus, they come face to face with the mustached mobster hanging. He was already lifeless, which causes panic among the people who visited the room. In the parking lot, the man wondered who had parked in such a pathetic way. He said they hadn't left any contact number. But suddenly, one of the mobsters falls abruptly onto that car, covered in blood. In some random butcher shop, the employees said they needed to bring some ice from the freezer. But when one of the men arrives at the location, he comes across something unprecedented. The brown-haired mobster was already dead, frozen, and trapped inside that freezer. The hefty Bian was fleeing from other mobsters in his wheelchair. For a moment, he managed to throw off Park's men. He said that Dong-soo was a scoundrel who, besides breaking his leg and humiliating him, was trying to kill him. He ran wildly, saying he wouldn't let it go and would take revenge, as he wouldn't die easily. But in his desperation, he crashed his wheelchair into a rock. This resulted in him being thrown directly into the sea, without being able to do anything to save himself. Days passed, and now in the Busan prison, a meeting was taking place. Park's lawyer said he came to see Dong-soo's brother on his behalf. The young man asked if anything had happened to Park, and the bespectacled man revealed that he had been attacked a few days ago, and the Sejong gang was behind the attack. The suited man handed a cigarette to the inmate, who reflected on the attack on his brother. The lawyer quickly exclaimed that he was safe and shouldn't worry. The brother said he was glad to hear that, but he didn't seem happy about anything. The lawyer revealed that they said he was the one who ordered the attack. Now that man became furious upon hearing this absurdity and said they didn't know who they were trying to frame. He denied all the accusations made against him and asked if Dong-su believed that. He couldn't even hold his cigarette without trembling. Thus, furious, he threw it to the ground abruptly. And once again, he asked if Dong-su believed this whole story, because if that were the case, he should go there personally to ask about it. In response, the lawyer placed a voice recorder on the table and ordered that man to listen to it. The audio was of Park saying he was very sorry for not being able to see him in person and was delivering this message through his lawyer. The audio continued with him saying he understood that he suspected him, as he had managed to hide all that time and escaped safely. And he argued that he had been working hard to prepare everything so that when he finished his sentence, he could live comfortably. Dong-su reported that he had been attacked recently, and the words were that his own brother had ordered it, but he didn't believe that. And still, Dong-su exclaimed that doubt had found its way into his heart. With that, he told his brother that he would take care of his family and his sister-in-law. And coldly, he asked his brother to leave. Continuing, he said that if he were alive, the monster in his heart would grow even larger, and if that happened, more blood would be shed. So if he refused, things would only get harder for both of them. Thus he asked him to make his decision. In this sense, the young man was completely dejected and asked the lawyer if Dong-su had really said that. Without expressing any feelings, the bespectacled man said it was exactly as he had heard. Now completely melancholic, Dong-su's brother was reflecting that Park had indeed said all that. After that, he asked what his brother planned to do after taking over Busan alone, as maintaining Busan wouldn't be an easy task. The lawyer revealed that after Busan was fully controlled, he would move on to expand to Seoul. Upon hearing this, the young man couldn't believe he was really trying to go to such a city, being the brother he knew. And suddenly, he began to laugh very loudly. He was proud of his brother, saying he was totally the boss at that moment. Thus, he stood up from the chair and asked the lawyer to tell his brother that he was very sorry. And finally, with an existential void on his face, he asked him to take care of himself and also take care of his family. On a rainy day, Park was in his office, very thoughtful. His lawyer revealed that his brother had passed away the day before. Dong-su's sadness was evident, but he didn't let it show and remained strong. After that, in a nightclub, Park's men surrounded their enemies to eliminate them. And the same happened with Park and his closest allies in another building. The enemies who were ready for battle said that the bastard was already there. The old man said that Seong died because of Park, and yet he wanted to dominate Hyundai. But without caring, Dong-su said that that man's talk always grew with age and urged them to face each other quickly. Thus, the fight began with the old man saying that Park was an ungrateful dog that even bit its owner. Dong-su's men also charged directly into the attack. Shortly after, everything was over according to plan, and the little punk was taking his doses in front of the sea. His lawyer arrived reporting that the cleanup in Hyundai was completed. He congratulated his men for a job well done and poured another glass for his lawyer. Dong-su was relieved that things were going well and everything was falling into place again. At that moment, he called his lawyer by name with a melancholic look and asked if he would not be embarrassed in front of Muyuk again. In the mansion of the Great Lone Shark, the old man asked Muyuk if he had foreseen the strange actions of the government in those days. Taizan explained that dozens of high-ranking officials in finance and economics had suddenly disappeared, taking vacations or on trips, but none of them had actually left the country. He added that he suspected they were doing something secretly, and even the infiltrated head of economic affairs did not know what was happening. The protagonist was already aware of what was happening, and finally, a real-named financial system would be implemented. Muyuk knew that some chaebols and financial companies had sensed the current climate. After the economic officials disappeared, there was no way for them to know. In light of this, the hero replied that it must be a new, real-named financial system, so they would be preparing it safely. Worried, the old man said it was possible, and that such a policy would have to be prepared secretly, so it could only be that. At that moment, the old man asked what the protagonist thought and exclaimed that he believed it would be announced in the next New Year's speech. In this regard, Muyuk denied, saying that with the president's personality, there was a chance he would implement it by August. Taizan was surprised by the response, as it was next month, and asked if it wouldn't be too soon. With that, Muyuk explained that the timing of the announcement was the most important part of the new financial system, so it should be announced when least expected. These words made the great old man enter into deep questioning. However, still firm, the old man said it was too soon, as this was one of his presidential election promises, and it would not be easy to get it approved in the assembly. Muyuk assumed that probably the other chaebols had come to the same conclusion as his grandfather, so everyone would be caught off guard when the new system was implemented in August. After all, less than a week after the announcement, it would pass in the National Assembly without a vote, with unanimous support from the parties. Without causing a stir, the hero asked if they shouldn't prepare for this, thus settling accounts in the name of third parties and anonymously. As advised last time, the old man said that the anonymous accounts were almost ready, and the third-party accounts would take longer due to their large scale. The hero knew he wouldn't be able to convince his grandfather, but just with the anonymous accounts, he would save a significant fortune for him, and it wouldn't be such a big loss as in his past life. Now Taisen said that, just as he sent 400 billion to America as the hero said, the director laundered the money without problems. The protagonist deeply thanked for everything his family had done for him. At that moment, the old man asked if Muyek had not forgotten the plans he had for today, and he replied that he had not. The mafioso said that if he were to deal with chaebols in the future, he needed to understand how they thought. Now he would meet the person with the living history of Korean chaebols, so he should go and learn as much as he could from him. Now inside the car, the protagonist told Director Had that by the end of that year, he would send Han Kam-yong to America, and he should transfer all the money from the US account to him. The director asked if he was trustworthy, as the total of 400 billion won was a lot of money. In response, Muyek revealed that he was going to create an investment company and hold a large portion of the shares, ensuring that he would be rewarded for his role. Had understood and said he would transfer it as soon as the order was issued. A doubt lingered in Muyek's mind, thus he asked who exactly Director He was, to which he did not understand the question. The protagonist explained that He was like a joker who could do anything, executing impeccably what Taisen asked of all kinds of things. He added that besides that, he knew that the director was behind the disappearance of President Yu Jigang from Myeongdong. Coldly, the bearded man says that when the president gives an order, he does not ask why and simply obeys, as that is his oath to him. Muyek notes that this man had absolute obedience. Still curious, the prota asks if, even if his grandfather gave him an unreasonable order, he would still comply. In response, he gives the example of an order that could kill him. Without thinking twice, the director says that if ordered, he would obey without problems. Still not satisfied, the protagonist asks what he would do if he ordered him to kill his grandson. Remaining cold and calculating, Hess says that if ordered, he would have to obey. At that moment, Prota understood what kind of person the director was, and even in his previous life, he had shown loyalty to his grandfather, and after his death, he disappeared without a trace. In light of this, Muyek said he had a favor to ask of that man, and so he says he could ask, humbly. The hero requests that he introduce him to someone like him, which surprises that man. Prota continues by saying that he wanted someone who would follow any orders without questioning, and a person he could count on and trust. At that moment, the director understood the message and said he would arrange things for him. Now they had arrived at the mansion of the great chaebol President Song. This man, who was pleased to have them there, said he was curious to see what the intelligent grandson of the president, who never stopped boasting, was like. He adds that he could not refuse that meeting, as it was Prota's grandfather who requested it, but he was not sure if he could teach anything more. Kindly, the protagonist says that just hearing his life story was already something valuable to him, for he was the living history of the chaebols, Koreans, and the economy itself. Song felt embarrassed to hear that, as he would have to tell his own story.
Our video ends here. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel. Until next time, bye bye.